My name is Dominique. I am 34 years old. My father abandoned me when I was 9 years old. My grandfather raised me. He was my rock and my only true family. Only after he passed away did I learn the massive empire he had secretly built. Suddenly, the father who walked out on me came back with a slick lawyer and a news camera crew. In court, he smirked, believing his political power would crush me. He claimed he loved my grandfather and kept letters to prove it. Every year. For 25 years. What he did not realize was that I am a forensic accountant. I follow the money and I do not lose. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use your own skills to destroy the greed of toxic family members who counted you out. Growing up in Atlanta, my grandfather Elias Washington was a neighborhood legend. He owned a humble barbershop in the historic Sweet Auburn district. It was not flashy, but it was a staple of the community. He worked with his hands from sunrise to sunset. He took me in when I was 9 after my father Calvin walked out to chase his political ambitions. My grandfather taught me the value of hard work, of keeping your head down and your books clean. I spent my childhood sweeping up hair from the barbershop floor and helping him count the cash register at the end of the day. Those early lessons in math and responsibility led me to become a forensic accountant. I spent my adult days unraveling financial fraud and tracking hidden assets for major corporate clients. I knew how to read people by reading their spending habits, but nothing could have prepared me to track the deception within my own bloodline. When my grandfather passed away, my entire world collapsed. The heartbreak was a heavy physical weight that settled in my chest. I handled all the funeral arrangements myself. I picked out his casket. I chose his favorite suit. I paid for the burial and the massive flower arrangements. I did it all without a single phone call or text message from my father. Calvin Washington had become a prominent city councilman in Atlanta. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice and the flash of a camera lens. He had built his entire political brand on the image of family values and community uplift. Yet he had not spoken to his own father in 2.5 decades. He did not visit when my grandfather was sick. He did not call when my grandfather passed. The funeral service was beautiful and deeply emotional. Afterward, we gathered in the basement of Greater Hope Baptist Church for the repast. The air in the large room was thick with the comforting smells of fried chicken, baked macaroni, and cheese and collard greens. I had paid for the entire catering spread myself, wanting to honor the man who had given me everything. The church elders were gathered around the folding tables sharing warm stories about Elias. The older women from the church choir were offering their condolences and wrapping me in tight hugs. It was a modest, respectful gathering. It was exactly what my grandfather would have wanted. I was standing near the buffet table making sure everyone had enough to eat, when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall suddenly flew open with a loud bang. The quiet murmur of the church basement was shattered by the blinding glare of a local news camera crew. They marched backward into the hall with bright lights flooding the dim room. Following right behind them was my father. Calvin looked the part of the grieving public servant. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit, and his face was arranged into a mask of profound, practiced grief. He held a white handkerchief in one hand, dabbing at eyes that held absolutely no tears. Clinging to his arm was my stepmother, Vivian. She was draped in expensive black designer fabrics, wearing a wide-brimmed church hat that screamed for attention. She wore the golden pin of her elite sorority proudly on her lapel, a silent signal that she considered herself above everyone else in this room. Behind them sauntered my 25-year-old half-sister, Chloe. She was the family golden child. She held her smartphone high on a portable ring light, live streaming her fake mourning to her thousands of followers on social media. She kept adjusting her hair and checking her angles, completely oblivious to the solemn nature of the repast. Trailing the group was Chloe's husband, Terrence. He was a slick corporate lawyer who wore his arrogance like cheap cologne. He scanned the church basement with a look of pure disgust on his face, adjusting his expensive silk tie. The intrusion was so sudden and so incredibly disrespectful that the entire church hall fell silent. The elders stopped eating. The choir women turned and stared in shock. The news cameras continued to roll, capturing the dramatic entrance of the city councilman returning to his roots to mourn his beloved father. It was a perfectly orchestrated public relations stunt. Vivian immediately wrinkled her nose in disgust as she looked at the buffet table. She did not even lower her voice as she spoke to the church elders standing nearby. You would think a dropout who plays with spreadsheets all day could afford a proper caterer for her grandfather. She scoffed, waving her manicured hand at the spread of traditional food. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with malice. If Calvin had not been funding that rundown barbershop for 2 decades, Elias would have died on the street. It is a disgrace that we have to come to this damp basement to mourn a man my husband supported out of the goodness of his heart. The sheer audacity of her lie echoed off the concrete walls. She was trying to publicly shame me while rewriting history for the local news cameras. She wanted the world to believe that Calvin was a saint who financially carried my grandfather. My professional instincts kicked in. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calculated. I looked at Vivian's designer bag and knew it was from last season. I looked at Terrence's luxury watch and knew it cost more than most public defenders made in a year. I felt the eyes of the church community burning into me, waiting to see how I would handle this blatant disrespect. Calvin saw the cameras positioning themselves for the perfect shot. He stepped away from Vivian and walked toward me with his arms wide open. He put on a tragic, sorrowful face. "My sweet daughter," he proclaimed loudly, making sure the microphones picked up every word. "We are here for you. We are family, and we will get through this dark time together. Come give your father a hug." He reached out to pull me into a tight embrace for the evening news broadcast. He wanted the perfect photo opportunity. The forgiving father comforting his estranged daughter. I did not let him touch me. I stepped right into the camera frame and firmly swatted his hand off my shoulder. The sharp smack of my hand against his expensive suit echoed through the silent room. Funding. I said, my voice dangerously calm but loud enough for every single microphone to catch. That is a funny word for draining a man's life savings to run for city council when I was 9 years old, and then changing your phone number for 25 years. The camera crew zoomed in instantly, catching the sudden panic flashing in Calvin's eyes. The church elders gasped. Vivian's jaw dropped open. I did not stop. I stepped closer to my father, forcing him to back up under the harsh glare of the camera lights. "You did not fund anything, Calvin." I continued, staring directly into his eyes. "My grandfather worked 12-hour shifts on his feet every single day until he died. You never sent a dime. You never sent a birthday card. You never even showed up to the hospital when he had his first stroke. So do not come into this church pretending to be a grieving son just because it is election season. You are nothing but a fraud, and everyone in this room knows it." The mask of the grieving public servant completely slipped from Calvin's face. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, boiling rage. He realized the cameras were still rolling, capturing his public humiliation. He quickly signaled to the cameraman to cut the feed, but the damage was already done. The truth was out in the open. Chloe lowered her phone, quickly ending her live stream as the comment section flooded with questions. Before Calvin could formulate a political response, Terrence stepped forward to take control of the situation. The slick corporate lawyer inserted himself between me and my father. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy legal envelope. He forcefully shoved it against my chest, making me take a step back. He smiled a cold, arrogant smile that made my stomach turn. "Do not get comfortable in Elias's house, Dominique," Terrence said, his voice dripping with condescension. "As Elias's only living son, Calvin, is the sole executor of the estate by default. We have officially frozen all of the bank accounts. You are legally barred from entering the Sweet Auburn property or the barber shop starting immediately." He tapped the envelope against my shoulder. "The court order is in there. You have exactly 48 hours to pack up whatever cheap clothes you have in that old house and vacate the premises. We are changing the locks on Monday morning. Do not try to take anything that belongs to the estate, or I will personally have you arrested for theft." Vivian stepped up next to Terrence, crossing her arms over her chest with a victorious smirk. "Your little forensic accounting hobby will not save you from the streets. she sneered. "You should have learned your place a long time ago. Now you are going to learn what happens when you disrespect this family. You get absolutely nothing." The church basement was suffocatingly quiet. Everyone watched me, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry over losing my childhood home and my grandfather's legacy. But I did not shed a single tear. I calmly took the thick envelope from Terrence's hand. I looked at the legal seal and then looked back up at his arrogant face. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. A good lawyer would have checked the county probate filings before printing a dramatic cease and desist letter on a Saturday afternoon. I whispered, leaning in so only he and my father could hear. "See you at the reading of the will, counselor." Terrence snatched his hand back as if the envelope had burned him. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a tight, rigid scowl. He leaned back, adjusting his custom suit jacket with a sharp tug. Calvin puffed out his chest, trying to regain the upper hand in front of the remaining church elders, who were watching us intently. "You always were a disrespectful child," Calvin muttered, his voice completely devoid of the fake warmth he had displayed for the cameras just moments ago. Vivian linked her arm through his, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Come on, Calvin," she sneered, tossing her head back. "We should not waste another second in this damp basement. The smell of cheap frying oil is getting into my expensive clothes." She stepped over a spilled paper napkin as if it were toxic waste. Chloe was already heading toward the concrete stairs, holding her smartphone high above her head. She had started a brand new live stream the exact second the local news crew packed up their heavy gear. She narrated her exit to her eager followers, complaining loudly about the total lack of valet parking and how traumatic it was to be in such a run-down neighborhood. They marched up the stairs, leaving the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind them. The church elders immediately rushed to my side, offering words of comfort and genuine outrage. I thanked them gently, ensuring they knew my grandfather would have appreciated their loyalty. But my mind was already racing miles ahead of the current moment. I knew exactly what Terrence and Calvin were planning to do next. They assumed I was just a grieving granddaughter who would be easily intimidated by aggressive legal jargon and an official-looking manila envelope. They assumed I would spend the entire weekend crying in my room and begging them for a little more time. They were entirely wrong. I walked out of the church into the humid Atlanta air and got into my car. The drive back to the sweet Auburn district was a blur of calculated strategic thoughts. My grandfather Elias had lived in the same sturdy brick house for 40 years. It was less than a mile from his beloved barber shop. When I pulled into the cracked concrete driveway, the property felt entirely different to me. It was no longer just a childhood home filled with warm memories. It was a highly contested financial asset. Terrence had given me 48 hours to vacate the premises. As a forensic accountant, I knew corporate lawyers who operated with that kind of unearned aggressive confidence. They rarely played by their own established rules. Terrence would not wait the full 48 hours. He would likely send a shady hired locksmith by Sunday evening to secure the property while claiming to a judge that it was a necessary emergency measure to protect the estate from theft. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside the quiet hallway. The house smelled faintly of my grandfather's favorite cherry pipe tobacco and peppermint shaving cream. A fresh wave of heavy grief threatened to rise in my throat, but I forcefully pushed it down. There would be plenty of time to mourn him later. Right now, I needed to secure my operational base. In my profession, I handled incredibly sensitive corporate data every single day. My home office in the spare bedroom was equipped with encrypted servers, heavy-duty hard drives, and specialized tracking software. If Terrence managed to illegally lock me out of the house, he would effectively separate me from my professional tools and entirely neutralize my ability to fight back against his fraudulent claims. I immediately grabbed 3 large, heavy-duty suitcases from the hall closet. I bypassed the sentimental items in the living room. I ignored the thick family photo albums and the ticking antique clocks on the mantel. I went straight down the hall to my office and began dismantling my complex digital infrastructure. I packed my main server, my backup drives, and my 2 primary work laptops. I secured physical copies of my own personal financial records in a fireproof lockbox. I worked methodically, with zero wasted movement. I treated my own home like a hostile corporate environment that was about to be raided by federal agents. Within 2 solid hours, my entire digital life was safely packed into the hidden trunk of my car. Only then did I return to the house to pack a single overnight bag of professional clothes and essential toiletries. I walked through the quiet, dimly lit rooms, inspecting the space one last time. Calvin and Vivian saw a decrepit old house in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. They saw a prime piece of real estate that could be quickly bulldozed and flipped to wealthy developers for a massive profit. They had completely underestimated the quiet man who owned it. Elias Washington was a man of few words, but profound deliberate action. He had survived decades of harsh economic redlining and shifting city politics. He did not build his quiet life to have it stolen by a selfish son who only cared about rising poll numbers and campaign contributions. I spent Saturday night sleeping on a temporary air mattress in my secure office space downtown. I woke up early on Sunday morning and drove slowly past the barber shop. The red and blue striped pole was completely still in the early light. A weathered closed sign hung silently in the front glass window. The shop had been a safe sanctuary for working-class black men for multiple generations. It was a place where local community organizers gathered and where bitter neighborhood disputes were peacefully settled over a clean fade. Now it was a visible target for a greedy politician looking for a quick, massive cash infusion. I sat in my parked car, watching the morning sun hit the faded brick facade. I pulled out my laptop and began running preliminary background checks on Terrence's corporate law firm. If they wanted a brutal financial war, I needed to know exactly who I was fighting. The rest of the weekend vanished into an intense blur of data extraction and meticulous legal preparation. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was fully mobilized and ready for battle. I wore a tailored slate gray suit that projected absolute unwavering authority. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight bun. I did not want a single stray hair to distract from my intense focus. I drove to the prestigious Buckhead district, navigating through the heavy morning traffic with cold precision. The law office handling the estate was located on the 30th floor of a glittering glass skyscraper. It was a completely different world away from the historic, lively streets of Sweet Auburn. I stepped off the quiet elevator into a vast lobby decorated with imported Italian marble and abstract modern art. The receptionist smiled politely, but her eyes quickly darted to the large glass-walled conference room located down the wide hall. I could already see them waiting inside. Calvin, Vivian, Chloe, and Terrence had arrived early to secure their positions. They were treating the solemn legal occasion like a celebratory victory lap. I walked down the thickly carpeted hallway and firmly pushed open the heavy glass door. The atmosphere inside the conference room was incredibly relaxed and celebratory. Vivian was sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, laughing loudly at something Calvin had just said. Chloe was slouched deeply in a plush leather chair, aggressively tapping on her glowing phone screen. She was actively ignoring the massive mahogany table in front of her. Terrence stood near the large window, looking down at the sprawling Atlanta skyline, with his hands tucked confidently into his tailored pockets. They all turned to look at me as I entered the room. The casual, joyful laughter instantly died. Vivian slammed her crystal water glass down on the wooden table, causing the ice to rattle loudly against the sides. "What is she doing here?" Vivian demanded, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at me. Calvin frowned heavily, adjusting his posture to look more physically imposing. "Dominique, when I thought Terrence made it perfectly clear that you were permanently excluded from all family assets," Calvin said, his voice dripping with fake, condescending sympathy. "You do not need to subject yourself to this painful process. It is a strictly closed family meeting." Chloe did not even bother to look up from her bright screen. She simply rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically heavily. "Grandpa's old junk is finally going to pay for my new cosmetic line," she announced loudly to the entire room. "It is about time that old property did something useful for this family instead of just gathering dust in the ghetto." She swiped a long finger across her phone display with an arrogant smirk. "I am literally picking out custom colors for my brand new Tesla right now. Do not ruin my winning vibe by bringing your miserable negative energy in here today." Terrence walked slowly back to the table, pulling out a comfortable chair for himself. He looked at me with the exact same smug expression he had worn at the church repast. "You were instructed to vacate the premises, Dominique. Your presence here is highly inappropriate and completely unnecessary. I am advising you to leave before things get legally complicated for you." I did not back down. I walked straight to the empty chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I placed my leather briefcase down with a deliberate authoritative thud. I looked directly at Vivian, who was still glaring at me as if I were a trespasser in her own private home. The receptionist quickly poked her head into the room looking highly uncomfortable. "Excuse me," she stammered, looking directly at Vivian. "I can call our security officers to politely escort her out of the building if you would like me to, ma'am." Vivian smiled a vicious, triumphant smile. "Yes, please do exactly that right now. The hired help certainly does not need to be sitting here for the official asset distribution. She belongs outside." Before the extremely nervous receptionist could even reach for her radio, a deep, commanding voice echoed from the heavy oak doors at the back of the elegant suite. The veteran estate attorney stepped briskly into the large room. He was a sharp, older black man with a well-trimmed silver beard who had been Elias's closest trusted friend for over 30 long years. He carried a thick, locked leather portfolio tightly under his right arm. He absolutely did not look at Calvin. He did not look at Terence. He looked directly at Vivian with dark eyes as cold and hard as polished steel. He stood incredibly tall and completely firm. "Nobody is calling security," he announced, his booming voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "And nobody is leaving this room today. Dominique is the sole primary beneficiary of this entire estate. Sit down, Vivian, right now and keep your mouth shut." Vivian's jaw snapped shut with a sharp, audible click. All the color rapidly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. Calvin immediately tried to salvage the situation. He plastered on his fake politician's smile and stood up quickly, smoothing his expensive silk tie. "Now, Marcus, let us not be hasty," Calvin said, using his deep, resonant campaign voice. "We all know my father was not in his right mind during his final days. My daughter means well, but the estate clearly belongs under my jurisdiction as his only living son and rightful heir." Marcus did not even blink. He walked slowly to the head of the heavy mahogany table and placed his locked leather portfolio squarely in the center. He took his seat with slow, deliberate movements. He unfastened the brass clasps with a loud metallic snap. I said, "Sit down, Calvin." Marcus repeated, his voice dropping a full octave. "This is not a city council meeting, and you do not have the floor. You are here to listen." Terence tried to step in, puffing out his chest to shield his father-in-law. "As Calvin's legal counsel, I must object to this hostile tone." Terence began, his voice tight and defensive. "We already filed a cease and desist order regarding the Sweet Auburn property. We are prepared to tie this entire estate up in probate court for years if necessary." Marcus pulled a thick stack of pristine legal documents from his portfolio. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked at Terence with absolute pity. "You can file whatever imaginary paperwork you want," Counselor Marcus said dryly. "But until you hear the contents of this certified legal will, you are operating completely in the dark. I strongly suggest you advise your client to take a seat before he embarrasses himself further." Calvin slowly sank back into his plush leather chair. The smug confidence that had filled the room just moments ago rapidly evaporated. Chloe finally looked up from her smartphone, her brow furrowed in genuine annoyance. "Wait a minute," Chloe whined loudly. "Why is the lawyer yelling at my dad? I thought we were just here to sign the papers so I can get my money. I have a brand new customized luxury car waiting in my online shopping cart. I need the bank wire transfer cleared by Tuesday morning." Silence fell over this room. It was thick and suffocating. I sat at the far end of the long table, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. My hands rested calmly on top of my leather briefcase. I watched the raw greed radiating from my father and his new family. They stared at the stack of papers in front of Marcus like hungry predators staring at a fresh kill. Marcus cleared his throat and opened the first thick folder. We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of Elias James Washington. He began, his voice echoing slightly against the glass walls. Elias was a man of immense foresight and quiet intelligence. Many people underestimated him because he chose to work with his hands. Many people assumed that a simple barbershop in the Sweet Auburn district was the total extent of his ambition. Those people were fundamentally wrong. Calvin leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the table. "Cut the sentimental nonsense," Marcus Calvin interrupted impatiently. "We know all about the barbershop, and we know about the old rundown house. Just tell us the final appraised value so we can authorize the demolition and sell the empty lots to my commercial developers." Marcus ignored the interruption entirely. Elias did not just cut hair, Marcus continued, turning a crisp white page. "Starting in the late 1980s, during a massive real estate downturn, your father began quietly acquiring commercial properties across the city of Atlanta. He bought abandoned warehouses. He bought empty corner lots. He bought dilapidated storefronts in overlooked neighborhoods that no one else cared about. He formed a complex series of blind trust companies and limited liability corporations to permanently mask his acquisitions. He held on to these properties for decades while the city grew and expanded aggressively around them." Vivian frowned deeply, looking genuinely confused. "What on earth are you talking about?" she asked, her voice turning shrill. "He was a barber. He drove a rusty 20-year-old truck. He drove a 20-year-old truck because he did not care about showing off." Marcus replied sharply. He cared about generational wealth. He cared about building a massive debt-free empire. Over the past 35 years, Elias Washington built a commercial real estate portfolio that is entirely unencumbered by mortgages or bank liens. Marcus slid a heavy-bound financial schedule across the polished wood table toward Calvin. He slid an identical copy toward Terrence. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own copy, placing it neatly in front of me. "The total appraised value of Elias Washington's estate," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "is exactly $12 million. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Chloe dropped her expensive smartphone directly onto the hard table. It clattered loudly against the wood, but she did not even reach to retrieve it. Vivian let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing her manicured hand over her chest as if she might physically faint. $12 million, Vivian repeated breathlessly, her eyes wide with undisguised greed. "Oh my God, Calvin, we are rich, we are incredibly rich." Calvin's eyes were practically bulging out of his head. He flipped frantically through the pages of the financial schedule, staring at the long columns of zeros and the lists of prime commercial addresses. His hands were actually visibly shaking. 12 million, he muttered, running his fingers over his mouth in utter disbelief. I had absolutely no idea the old man was hiding a fortune. The old man was hiding. This changes everything. This fully changes my entire mayoral campaign. Terrence grabbed the heavy document from Calvin, reading the numbers with hungry, intense desperation. "This is a massive corporate portfolio," Terrence whispered in sheer awe. "We can leverage these liquid assets immediately. We can liquidate the smaller properties and reinvest the capital into luxury condominiums. The financial returns will be astronomical." They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already tearing down my grandfather's entire legacy to fund their shallow, empty lives. I watched them celebrate, sitting in complete cold silence. I waited for the inevitable massive hammer to drop. Marcus let them rejoice for exactly 30 long seconds. Then he loudly cleared his throat and forcefully tapped his metal pen against the table. "I suggest you hold your celebrations until I read the actual legal distribution of the assets," Marcus stated coldly. Calvin sat back in his chair, waving his hand magnanimously. "Of course," Marcus proceeded. "As the only living son, the inheritance naturally falls to me. Let us handle the boring legal formalities." Marcus adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the official sealed document. "To my son, Calvin Washington." Marcus read aloud, his voice deliberate and crystal clear. "I leave the sum of exactly $1." The air was instantly sucked out of the room. Calvin froze mid-smile. His hand stopped moving completely. "What did you just say?" Calvin whispered, leaning forward so far he nearly fell out of his chair. "I leave the sum of exactly $1, Marcus repeated loudly, projecting his voice across the room. "This specific legal bequest is made to clearly demonstrate that I have not forgotten him in this will, but rather that I have intentionally chosen to exclude him from any meaningful share of my estate due to his complete total abandonment of this family." Calvin's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He slammed both of his fists down on the mahogany table, causing the water glasses to shake. "That is completely impossible," he roared. "That is a fraudulent forged document. My father loved me." Marcus completely ignored the violent outburst and continued reading. "To my daughter-in-law, Vivian Washington, to my granddaughter Chloe Washington, and to her husband Terrence, I leave absolutely nothing. I legally direct that they shall receive no portion of my assets, no personal property, and no financial benefit from my life's work whatsoever." Vivian shrieked, jumping up from her leather chair. "Nothing? Are you completely insane? You cannot leave us nothing. We are his actual family." Chloe burst into loud, genuine tears. "But my cosmetic line," she wailed, stomping her high heel on the carpeted floor. "What about my new car? You promised me a car, Daddy. You said the old man's money was ours." Marcus raised his voice, cutting sharply through the chaotic screaming. "To my beloved granddaughter, Dominique Washington," Marcus read, looking directly at me with a soft, proud smile. "Who stayed by my side, who washed my clothes, who managed my books, and who showed me what true loyalty means. I leave the entirety of my estate. I bequeath to Dominique all $12 million in assets, including full executive control over all limited liability corporations, trust accounts, real estate holdings, and the historic barbershop property on Sweet Auburn Avenue. She is the sole primary beneficiary." The glass-walled conference room erupted into absolute madness. Calvin completely lost his polished political composure. He kicked his heavy chair back so hard it crashed violently into the glass wall behind him. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You thief!" Calvin screamed, his voice echoing harshly through the suite. "You conniving, greedy little thief! You manipulated him! You poisoned his sick mind against me." Terrence slammed both of his hands violently onto the table, leaning over it with a menacing, furious glare. "This is a complete sham," Terrence shouted, his face turning bright red. "Elias had severe dementia. He was medically incompetent. You isolated a sick old man and brainwashed him into signing away my father-in-law's rightful legacy. This is a textbook case of extreme undue influence." I sat perfectly still, absorbing their collective rage like a sponge. I did not shrink back. I did not raise my voice to match theirs. I let them completely exhaust their own breath. "I am filing an emergency injunction," Terrence continued, aggressively pointing his finger at Marcus. "I am filing for an immediate conservatorship, and I am pressing criminal charges against her for elder abuse. You are going to federal prison, you fraud. We will tie this up in brutal litigation until you are completely bankrupt and begging for a settlement. You will never see a single dime of that $12 million. Vivian was hyperventilating, clinging tightly to Calvin's arm. "Call the police, Calvin. Have her arrested right now. She stole your birthright. She stole our entire future." I calmly reached forward and picked up my pristine copy of the financial schedule. I slid it neatly into my leather briefcase and snapped the golden locks shut with a sharp click. I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. I looked at my father, whose face was twisted in ugly, bitter rage. I looked at Vivian, who was sobbing fake, dramatic tears of victimhood. I looked at Chloe, who was throwing a literal tantrum like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. Finally, I turned my gaze directly to Terrence. The slick corporate lawyer was breathing heavily, staring at me with pure, unadulterated venom. He thought his loud, aggressive legal threats would intimidate me. He thought he could easily bully me into submission with big words and a loud voice. I picked up my briefcase and walked calmly around the edge of the large mahogany table. I stopped right next to Terrence. He tried to stare me down, puffing out his chest to look physically taller and more imposing. I slowly looked him up and down, taking in his expensive custom suit, his tailored silk shirt, and the heavy silver watch resting prominently on his left wrist. "You have my professional email address." "Terrence," I said. my voice dropping to a cold, deadly whisper that cut right through the screaming in the room. But let me offer you a pro tip from a certified forensic accountant. I leaned in slightly closer, making sure he caught every single syllable. Do not threaten a criminal fraud charge when you are wearing a custom $4,000 timepiece on a public defender's meager salary. It makes people extremely curious about where your extra cash is secretly coming from. Terrence froze entirely. His mouth snapped shut. The aggressive, confident posturing instantly vanished from his body. His eyes darted downward in a panic to his own wrist and then shot back up to my face. A flash of pure, genuine terror crossed his features. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on my screaming father and his hysterical, broken new family. I walked out of the glass conference room with my head held high and my briefcase firmly in my hand. I stepped into the quiet elevator and pressed the button for the main lobby. The metal doors slid shut, silencing their pathetic rage completely. I had $12 million in empire to fiercely protect and a brutal war to win. The descent to the main lobby felt like crossing into an entirely different dimension. I stepped out of the glittering glass skyscraper and into the blistering Atlanta heat, knowing with absolute certainty that my father would not take this massive defeat lying down. Calvin Washington was a cornered, desperate animal. He had built his entire political career on projecting a flawless family image, and now his own father had legally and financially rejected him in front of his new family. I knew the retaliation would be swift and brutal. I just did not realize how fast he would pull the political trigger. By Tuesday morning, the shadow war officially began. I arrived at my boutique accounting firm in Midtown to find two grim-faced inspectors from the City Department of Revenue waiting impatiently in the lobby. Calvin had pulled serious political strings, leveraging his city council influence to trigger a random aggressive audit of my business licenses and corporate tax filings. They demanded immediate access to 5 years of my client ledgers. It was a blatant intimidation tactic designed to completely paralyze my daily operations and drain my resources. I did not panic. I calmly handed them the digital access keys to my pristine, perfectly organized files. They scoured my digital drives, searching for a single misplaced decimal or an unauthorized deduction that Calvin could use to publicly discredit my financial expertise. I knew they would find absolutely nothing, but the disruption was the entire point. The financial squeeze was only the first wave. The social assassination came next. Vivian weaponized her elite social circles with lethal precision. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone was blowing up with frantic messages from colleagues. Vivian had deployed her vast sorority and exclusive country club networks to spread a vicious whisper campaign. The rumor was toxic. She told everyone in high society that I had locked my grandfather in the damp basement of his sweet Auburn home, that I had systematically starved him, and that I had maliciously forged his signature on the new will while he was suffering from severe advanced dementia. The lies were entirely baseless, but in those wealthy circles, perception is absolute reality. Then came the unhinged digital mob. Chloe activated her massive social media following. She posted a highly edited weeping video claiming her cruel estranged half-sister had stolen her rightful family inheritance to fund a lavish, selfish lifestyle. She sat in her luxury, high-rise apartment wearing designer clothes, shedding fake, carefully manufactured tears while begging her followers for emotional support. The video went viral locally within hours. My professional inbox was flooded with aggressive hate mail. My firm received hundreds of negative fake reviews online designed to tank my search engine rankings. Two of my biggest corporate clients called to suddenly terminate their lucrative retainer contracts, citing the bad press surrounding my name. They bluntly stated they could not afford to be associated with a potential elder abuse scandal. Calvin wanted to break my spirit. He wanted to drain my resources, destroy my professional reputation, and force me to the negotiating table broken and begging for a settlement. He severely underestimated the mind of a forensic accountant. While they were busy playing loud public games, I retreated into complete total silence. I locked myself inside my kitchen with pots of black coffee and multiple glowing monitors. I did not waste a single ounce of energy crying over lost clients or social media trolls. I leaned into the one thing I understood better than anyone else in the city. I followed the hidden money. I knew Terrence was far too arrogant to be a clean, honest lawyer. His customized, tailored suits and imported luxury vehicles did not align with a standard corporate salary. People who care that much about looking wealthy are usually drowning in massive hidden debt. I initiated a deep, comprehensive shadow audit of his law firm and his personal assets. I pulled public property tax records, municipal zoning permits, and obscure county tax assessments. I spent 48 straight hours tracing a complex labyrinth of digital paper trails. During my shadow audit of Terrence's firm, I accessed public municipal servers and uncovered a highly suspicious chain of shell company registrations. I downloaded the primary incorporation document and saved it locally as A1_8.docuts for my encrypted records. The paper trail was messy, but incredibly deliberate. I tracked the routing numbers to an offshore account and compiled the transaction history into a master file named A2_8.docs. Terrence was aggressive, but he was remarkably sloppy. The cluster of newly registered LLCs tied directly to his firm was actively buying up commercial property in the Sweet Auburn district right around my grandfather's historic barber shop. They were trying to force a massive gentrification buyout, but they needed heavy capital to execute the purchases, capital they clearly did not possess. I just needed to find out who was secretly funding their illegal shadow monopoly. I carried the heavy leather ledger and the locked cedar box upstairs to the quiet kitchen. The sheer weight of the physical evidence in my hands was deeply intoxicating. Every single page of that weathered ledger was a highly detailed, meticulous roadmap of my father's extensive financial corruption. But while I was actively analyzing 25 years of hidden extortion, my father was aggressively mobilizing his entire political machine against me. Calvin Washington was a man who understood public optics far better than he understood actual morality. He knew he could not easily defeat me in a legitimate legal battle over a medically verified will. His only viable strategy was to completely destroy my personal and professional credibility before we ever stepped foot inside a formal courtroom. The initial wave of his retaliation had been the aggressive city tax audit and some nasty quiet rumors. But by Thursday morning, the targeted smear campaign evolved into a highly coordinated, relentless media assault. Vivian leveraged her elite alumni networks and high society charity boards with absolute ruthless efficiency. She was the grand dame of the Atlanta social scene, and she knew exactly how to weaponize a wealthy whisper. It started as hushed conversations at expensive, exclusive country club luncheons. Vivian would casually lean across a table of influential women and gently dab her dry eyes with a monogrammed silk napkin. She painted a horrifying fictional picture of my grandfather's final months on Earth. She told everyone who would listen that I had maliciously locked a frail, confused Elias in the damp, dark basement of the Sweet Auburn house. She claimed I deliberately starved him, isolated him from his loving family, and aggressively withheld his heart medication until he agreed to sign over his massive estate. These baseless, vicious lies spread like a catastrophic wildfire through the city's elite circles. Suddenly, my name was synonymous with extreme elder abuse. My professional reputation, built on a decade of flawless financial integrity, was being systematically shredded by a woman who had not worked a single legitimate day in her entire adult life. Chloe ensured the vicious rumors reached the younger, highly reactive digital demographic. She propped up her smartphone ring light in her luxury high-rise apartment and filmed a highly dramatic, heavily edited video for her 3 million followers. She wore zero makeup and dressed in oversized designer sweatpants to project an image of devastating, authentic grief. She stared directly into the camera lens with wide, watery eyes and delivered an absolute Oscar-worthy performance. My cruel, estranged half-sister literally stole my entire family inheritance, Chloe sobbed aggressively, wiping away perfectly timed tears. She manipulated my sick, dying grandfather and robbed us completely blind just to fund her own lavish, selfish lifestyle. She took the money my father desperately needed to help the local community. She took the money I was going to use to launch my cosmetic brand. She is a complete monster. Chloe did not just post the crying video, she actively encouraged her massive army of digital followers to seek absolute ruthless justice on her behalf. The digital mob descended on my life with terrifying, incredible speed. Within 24 hours, my accounting firm's professional social media pages were completely obliterated by thousands of hateful comments. My business phone lines rang incessantly with anonymous blocked numbers shouting aggressive, violent threats. People I had never even met were actively trying to locate my home address and dox my personal information online. Calvin's subtle strategic media leaks ensured the story rapidly jumped from social media platforms to legitimate local news blogs. The headlines were universally devastating. Local city councilman's estranged daughter accused of multi-million-dollar elder fraud. The calculated public pressure was designed to completely suffocate me. Calvin wanted me to feel entirely isolated, hunted, and universally despised. He wanted me to panic and surrender the $12 million estate just to make the relentless daily harassment stop. The immense public pressure quickly translated into catastrophic financial consequences for my private business. I arrived at my office on Friday morning to find an urgent calendar invite from my top 2 corporate clients. They were massive regional logistics companies that constituted over 70% of my firm's annual billing revenue. I sat down in my glass-walled conference room and connected the secure video call. The 2 corporate CEOs looked incredibly uncomfortable, actively refusing to make direct eye contact with the camera. Dominique, we have thoroughly reviewed the recent intense media coverage surrounding your family estate. One of the executives began, his voice tight and overly formal. We understand these are strictly private family matters, but the public optics of the situation are highly problematic for our corporate brand. We simply cannot have our primary forensic accountant publicly linked to severe allegations of forgery and elder abuse. I maintained my absolute, unwavering professional composure. I sat perfectly straight and looked directly into the glowing camera lens. Those allegations are entirely baseless and currently unproven in any court of law, I stated calmly. I have managed your complex corporate ledgers with flawless precision for 6 solid years. I have legally recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets for your private shareholders. My personal family disputes do not impact my professional financial expertise in any capacity. The second CEO sighed heavily, shifting awkwardly in his expensive leather chair. It is not about your accounting skills, Dominique. It is about corporate liability and severe public relations. Calvin Washington is a highly powerful city councilman with deep, extensive political ties. We rely heavily on municipal city contracts for our primary logistics routes. We absolutely cannot afford to be caught in the crossfire of his political warfare. We are officially terminating your retainer contract effective immediately. Our legal department will forward the standard severance paperwork by the end of the business day. They abruptly disconnected the call, leaving me staring at a blank black screen. In less than a single week, Calvin had successfully weaponized the entire city against me. He had mobilized the local media, mobilized the social elite, and actively destroyed my primary source of reliable income. He was attempting to aggressively starve me out financially. He expected me to completely break down. He expected me to call Terrence in hysterical tears, begging for a tiny fraction of my grandfather's estate, just to save my failing business. He expected me to fold under the immense crushing weight of his political power. But Calvin Washington had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot that I was raised entirely by Elias Washington. I did not just inherit my grandfather's money. I inherited his absolute unbreakable iron will. I did not waste a single second shedding tears over cowardly corporate clients. I forwarded my office phone lines directly to voicemail, locked the heavy glass doors of my firm, and drove straight back to the sweet Auburn house. I cleared the large wooden kitchen table, forcefully pushing aside the junk mail and old coffee mugs. I replaced them with towering stacks of complex tax codes, printed municipal property deeds, and the heavy leather ledger I had extracted from the hidden basement safe. I opened the locked cedar box using a heavy set of steel bolt cutters, snapping the tiny brass padlock with a sharp, violent crack. Inside the box, I found dozens of sealed yellowed envelopes dating back 25 years. I set them carefully aside for later. Right now, I needed to completely dismantle Terrence's immediate financial infrastructure. I sat at the kitchen table for 48 straight hours, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my dual computer monitors. I cross-referenced every single handwritten entry in my grandfather's ledger with the digital public property records I had downloaded earlier. My eyes burned intensely, and my shoulders ached, but I completely refused to sleep. I was operating in a state of pure, unadulterated adrenaline and icy, calculated rage. Terrence had arrogantly claimed he was going to legally destroy me in probate court. But as I dug deeper into his shadow limited liability corporations, I realized the slick lawyer was incredibly financially desperate. I traced the aggressive property acquisitions happening all around the Sweet Auburn district. Terrence's specific law firm was acting as the primary registered agent for a massive anonymous shell company. This shell company was systematically buying up every single dilapidated storefront and empty dirt lot within a 2-mile radius of my grandfather's barbershop. They were paying substantially over market value, closing the real estate deals with massive all-cash offers. But the complex math absolutely did not make sense. Terrence was a mid-level corporate attorney with a lavish, highly visible spending habit. Chloe produced zero actual steady income. Calvin's political salary was transparent public record. They simply did not have the liquid capital required to fund a multi-million-dollar aggressive gentrification project. I followed the money. I tracked the specific routing numbers from the shell company's property purchases backward through a dense labyrinth of corporate tax filings and blind trust accounts. I ripped apart their financial disguises layer by layer until I finally hit the absolute bedrock of their illegal operation. The cash funding the aggressive real estate acquisitions was not coming from a traditional bank loan. It was not coming from a wealthy, hidden political donor. The massive cash injections were coming directly from a private specialized lending firm called Apex Capital. I typed the exact name Apex Capital into the state corporate registry database. I hit the enter key and waited for the secure server to return the official incorporation documents. The digital file loaded slowly on my screen, detailing the original founding members, the registered executive agents, and the primary corporate shareholders. I stared at the bright monitor, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I read the name explicitly listed as the sole primary owner of Apex Capital. It was not a shadowy overseas investor. It was not a corrupt municipal politician. The sole registered owner of the massive private lending firm was Elias James Washington. My grandfather had not just quietly purchased commercial real estate, he had quietly established a highly lucrative private lending firm that financed massive commercial developments across the entire state. And Terrence, in his blinding, arrogant greed, had unknowingly borrowed millions of dollars from the exact same man he was now actively trying to declare medically incompetent. He had secretly mortgaged his entire professional future using my grandfather's hidden money. I leaned back in my hard wooden chair, staring at the staggering, undeniable financial proof illuminated on my glowing screen. The smear campaign, the vicious rumors, the canceled corporate contracts, none of it mattered anymore. Calvin and Terrence thought they were aggressively squeezing me out of the picture. They had absolutely no idea that I was already holding the financial guillotine directly over their necks. I carefully packed the heavy leather ledger, the contents of the cedar box, and the explosive Apex Capital printouts into a waterproof, secure satchel. I knew exactly how dangerous this specific information was. Terrence and Calvin were playing a ruthless political game, but I was holding the absolute destruction of their entire financial reality. I could not leave these documents sitting on the kitchen table. I needed to move them off-site immediately. I grabbed my car keys, locked the heavy deadbolts of the Sweet Auburn house, and drove straight to a private high-security bank vault in Midtown. The drive was tense, but my mind was completely clear. The smear campaign was currently raging across the city, destroying my accounting firm and dragging my professional reputation through the mud. Every local news station was actively broadcasting Calvin's strategically leaked lies about elder abuse and forged wills. I ignored all of it. I walked into the heavily guarded bank facility, signed the strict biometric access logs, and secured the original documents inside a steel safety deposit box. I kept only the heavily encrypted digital backups on a secure flash drive tucked into my jacket pocket. With the physical evidence safely locked away out of Calvin's political reach, I finally felt a cold wave of absolute control wash over me. I navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic back toward the Sweet Auburn district. The brutal summer sun was beating down on the asphalt, creating thick, shimmering heat waves above the road. As I turned the corner onto my grandfather's quiet, historic street, my foot instantly slammed against the brake pedal. A large, unmarked white commercial van was parked illegally half on the sidewalk, directly in front of Elias's brick house. My blood ran completely cold, but my mind immediately shifted into pure, calculated forensic focus. I pulled my vehicle silently behind the commercial van and killed the engine. Vivian and Chloe were standing on the wide wooden front porch. They were dressed in immaculate, expensive country club attire, looking completely ridiculous and entirely out of place against the weathered historic architecture of the working-class neighborhood. Standing directly between them was a burly man in a sweat-stained gray uniform holding an industrial-grade power drill. He was actively lining up the heavy steel drill bit against the antique brass deadbolt of the front door. They were not waiting for the slow turning wheels of the probate court. They were attempting an illegal forced entry. I stepped out of my car and walked purposefully up the cracked concrete walkway. I did not shout, I did not curse, I did not give them the hysterical, emotional reaction they were desperately hoping to provoke. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and hit the bright red record button. I held the camera steady, capturing the unmarked van, the locksmith, the drill, and the two women orchestrating the active break-in. What exactly is the objective here? I asked, my voice projecting clear, unwavering authority across the front lawn. Vivian spun around, dropping her expensive leather handbag to her side. Her perfectly contoured face immediately contorted into a vicious, ugly mask of pure contempt. She stepped in front of the hired locksmith, acting as a physical human shield while pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Calvin is the rightful heir," Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "We are securing the property that legally belongs to my husband. You are just a bitter, unmarried woman who clung to an old man because absolutely no one else wanted you. Get off our property right now before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Chloe immediately pulled out her own smartphone, attempting to document the confrontation for her rabid social media followers. She angled her camera to capture her mother's aggressive posture. "Tell her mom," Chloe cheered loudly. "Tell the whole internet how this thief locked my sick grandfather in a basement and stole our generational wealth." I completely ignored the spoiled 20-something and kept my camera focused squarely on the man holding the power tool. "Sir," I said, my tone perfectly level and distinctly professional. "My name is Dominique Washington. I am the sole primary beneficiary and the sworn legal executor of this probated estate. The two women who hired you have zero legal claim or court-authorized access to this property." The locksmith paused, lowering the heavy drill slightly. He looked nervously between my steady recording phone and Vivian's furious, glaring face. "I am just doing a foreclosure lockout job, lady," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The client paid cash up front and said they owned the building." "They lied to you," I stated calmly, stepping onto the bottom stair of the wooden porch. "If you proceed to drill that lock, you are committing intentional destruction of property and breaking and entering. Under the official code of Georgia, annotated section 16-7-21, that constitutes criminal trespass on a probated estate. Because the total value of this property far exceeds $500, your actions instantly elevate from a misdemeanor to a felony. I have the certified court documents sitting right there in my glove compartment. If you touch that door, you are acting as a direct accessory to a felony, and I will personally ensure your commercial contractor license is permanently revoked by the state board before the sun sets today." The silence that fell over the porch was absolute. The burly contractor stared at me, realizing instantly that I was not a bluffing, angry relative. I was quoting specific state penal codes and actively documenting his face for a police report. He did not want to be caught in the crossfire of a wealthy family's illegal probate war. He certainly did not want to risk federal prison or the loss of his livelihood over a routine cash job. "I am not getting involved in this mess," the locksmith grumbled, shaking his head in deep disgust. He aggressively shoved his heavy power drill back into his canvas tool bag and zipped it shut with a loud, sharp motion. Vivian gasped, her eyes widening in sheer panic as her hired muscle abandoned the job. "You cannot leave," she shrieked, grabbing his thick arm. "I paid you $500 to open that door. We have a verbal contract. Finish the job right now." The locksmith forcefully shook off her manicured grip. "Keep the money, lady," he growled, stepping heavily down the wooden stairs right past me. "I am not catching a felony charge for a crazy family dispute. Find another sucker." He practically sprinted to his unmarked white van, threw his heavy canvas bag into the passenger seat, and sped away down the street, leaving a thick, dark cloud of exhaust fumes hanging in the humid air. Vivian and Chloe were left completely powerless and utterly humiliated, standing stranded on the front porch. The aggressive bravado that had fueled their illegal break-in rapidly dissolved into desperate, sputtering rage. Chloe frantically stopped her video recording, realizing that documenting her own mother attempting to commission a felony was a terrible strategy for her digital brand. She shoved her smartphone back into her designer pocket and crossed her arms, sulking furiously. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Vivian screamed, her voice echoing shrilly down the quiet neighborhood block. "You think playing lawyer is going to save you? Calvin has the entire city government in his back pocket. We are auditing your pathetic little accounting firm into total oblivion. We are dragging your name through the mud until you cannot even secure a job scanning barcodes at a grocery store. You are going to be completely destitute, Dominique. You will be begging us on your hands and knees for a settlement." I walked slowly up the remaining wooden stairs. I did not flinch as I closed the physical distance between us. I stopped mere inches from Vivian. The heavy, cloying scent of her imported floral perfume hung thickly in the stagnant air. She expected me to scream back. She desperately wanted a chaotic emotional reaction that she could use to validate her victimhood. Instead, I offered her absolutely nothing but a cold, dead stare. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. Vivian opened her mouth to shout another threat, but the words caught painfully in her throat. She physically recoiled from the sheer intensity of my composure. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my heavy brass keyring. I stepped smoothly around her rigid, frozen body and slid the original key directly into the antique lock. The heavy deadbolt turned with a loud, satisfying metallic click. I pushed the thick wooden door open, revealing the cool, dark sanctuary of my grandfather's home. I turned back to face them one last time. "You should really call Terrence and check on his blood pressure," I said casually, resting my hand on the brass doorknob. "Tell him I found the Apex Capital files. Tell him I know exactly who owns his debt." All the remaining color instantly drained from Vivian's face. She had absolutely no idea what Apex Capital was, but she recognized the genuine, undeniable threat radiating from my words. Chloe looked back and forth between us, completely confused and entirely out of her depth. I stepped smoothly across the threshold into the cool hallway. "Get off my porch, Vivian," I commanded sharply. "If you ever step foot on this property again, I will not bother giving you a penal code warning. I will simply let the police drag you away in handcuffs." I slammed the heavy, solid oak door shut right in their faces. I engaged the deadbolt, locked the chain, and flipped the secondary security latch. I stood alone in the quiet hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of Vivian throwing a massive, furious tantrum outside before their expensive high heels clicked rapidly down the concrete walkway in total retreat. I walked straight into the kitchen and opened my laptop. The physical confrontation had confirmed everything I suspected. Calvin and his family were panicking. They were escalating to reckless, illegal tactics because the smear campaign was not forcing me to surrender fast enough. Terrence's massive shadow real estate project was heavily leveraged and completely stalling out without fresh capital. They needed the Sweet Auburn property, and they needed my grandfather's $12 million estate to cover their massive hidden debts before the financial house of cards entirely collapsed. I pulled up my secure email server and typed in the contact information for Marcus, the veteran estate attorney who had read the will. I needed to move the battlefield from the court of public opinion directly into the legal arena, where I held all the live ammunition. I drafted a highly encrypted message requesting an immediate emergency meeting at his downtown office. I attached a single redacted screenshot of the Apex Capital Incorporation document, explicitly proving Elias Washington was the sole owner and primary lender, funding Terrence's corrupt commercial real estate acquisitions. The trap was now fully set. Calvin thought he was burying me under city audits and digital mobs. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of political chess. He did not realize I had already flipped the entire board. I closed the laptop screen and took a deep, steadying breath. It was time to systematically dismantle my father's empire and make them pay for every single lie they had told. I sat in the silent kitchen of the sweet Auburn house, letting the reality of the impending war settle over my shoulders. Taking down Terrence and exposing his fraudulent real estate acquisitions was a satisfying opening maneuver, but it was only the first half of the battle. Terrence was merely a greedy symptom of a much larger disease. To permanently neutralize the threat against my grandfather's legacy, I needed to cut the head off the snake. I needed to destroy Calvin Washington. I needed something far more devastating than corporate shell companies and over-leveraged loans to bring down a sitting city councilman. I needed direct, undeniable proof of his political corruption. I closed my laptop screen and took a deep, steadying breath. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the final weeks I had spent with my grandfather. Inside the quiet, empty house, a specific memory suddenly surfaced, cutting through the noise of the day with absolute clarity. We had been standing right here in the hallway. Elias was leaning heavily on his wooden cane. He had pointed his weathered finger down toward the scuffed hardwood floorboards. "The true foundation of this house is not made of brick, Dominique," he had whispered, his voice raspy but intensely focused. "People always look at the fresh paint. They look at the new roof. They never bother to look at the foundation. The foundation of this family is made of the things people think they successfully buried. You remember that when the wolves come knocking at the door?" At the time, I had assumed it was just the cryptic musings of an exhausted old man reflecting on a long, difficult life. But Elias Washington never wasted a single breath on meaningless metaphors. Everything he did was deliberate. Every word he spoke was a calculated instruction. He knew Calvin would immediately launch a ruthless assault the second the will was read. He knew his son would stop at nothing to seize the $12 million estate. Elias was telling me exactly where to look for my ammunition. I pushed my chair back from the kitchen table and walked slowly down the hallway toward the heavy door that led to the basement. I pulled the pull-string light switch, illuminating the narrow wooden staircase. The stairs creaked in familiar rhythm beneath my feet as I descended into the cool, damp air. The basement smelled of old pine cherry pipe tobacco and decades of undisturbed dust. It was packed with cardboard boxes containing old barbershop supplies, antique clippers, and forgotten holiday decorations. But I bypassed all the clutter. I walked directly toward the far concrete wall at the back of the foundation. Hanging perfectly centered on the rough concrete surface was a massive framed portrait of my grandfather. It was an oil painting commissioned in the early 1990s, showing Elias standing proudly in front of his newly opened barbershop. Throughout my entire childhood, Elias had been fiercely protective of this specific painting. He kept the glass meticulously clean, but he absolutely forbade anyone else from touching it. Whenever Vivian or Calvin complained that the basement needed to be renovated and cleared out, Elias would shut them down with a terrifying cold fury, demanding they stay away from his portrait. I stood in front of the heavy gilded frame. I reached out and gripped the thick wooden edges. I hoisted the heavy painting upward, lifting the thick wire off the heavy iron hooks anchored into the wall. I set the portrait carefully on the concrete floor. I stared at the wall behind where the painting had hung. To the untrained eye, it looked like a standard patch of poorly finished drywall covering an old foundational repair. But I stepped closer, running my fingertips over the chalky white surface. The texture was slightly different from the surrounding concrete. The edges were perfectly straight, forming a subtle square outline that had been cleverly blended with thick layers of industrial plaster. I balled my hand into a fist and knocked hard against the center of the square. The sound did not produce a dull thud. It produced a sharp, hollow echo. I turned around and scanned the old wooden workbench resting against the adjacent wall. I quickly spotted a heavy steel framing hammer lying next to a rusted vice grip. I picked up the hammer, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the rubberized grip in my hand. I walked back to the false wall. I did not hesitate. I swung the hammer backward and drove the heavy steel head directly into the center of the hollow square with all my strength. The drywall shattered instantly. A thick cloud of white gypsum dust exploded into the stagnant air coating the sleeves of my tailored suit jacket. I swung the hammer again and again, smashing through the clever facade with a deep, visceral satisfaction. I ripped the jagged chunks of broken drywall away with my bare hands, tossing them onto the floor. Behind the shattered plaster, sitting securely inside a deep recessed cavity carved directly into the actual concrete foundation, was a massive fireproof steel safe. The safe was ancient, but incredibly formidable. It was a heavy-duty commercial-grade lockbox made of thick reinforced iron, featuring a digital keypad that looked completely out of place on the vintage metal surface. I blew the thick layer of white dust off the black rubber keys. I did not have to guess the combination. Elias was a man who trusted his roots. I pressed the 4 numbers corresponding to his birth year, 1938. A small green light flashed on the keypad. A loud, heavy metallic clank echoed through the basement as the internal steel bolts retracted. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled the thick iron door open. There were no massive stacks of hidden $100 bills inside. There were no gold bars or bearer bonds. Sitting squarely in the center of the fireproof chamber was a pristine, thick, leather-bound accounting ledger. Resting directly beside it was a beautiful, intricately carved wooden cedar box, secured with a tiny, heavy brass padlock. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy leather ledger. The binding cracked slightly as I opened the thick cover. I placed the book under the hanging overhead bulb and turned to the very first page. My eyes widened as my forensic training instantly kicked into overdrive. The pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous, elegant handwriting. It was not a record of his barbershop income. It was not a ledger of his brilliant commercial real estate acquisitions. It was a flawless, terrifyingly detailed 25-year financial record of every single dollar Calvin Washington had secretly extorted from his own father. I turned the heavy pages, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, as the sheer staggering magnitude of Calvin's corruption revealed itself in stark black ink. The very first entry was dated 25 years ago during Calvin's initial run for a seat on the city council. Calvin had demanded $50,000 to fund an illegal shadow campaign to smear his political opponent. Next to the dollar amount, Elias had recorded the exact threat Calvin had used to secure the money. Calvin had threatened to use his municipal connections to have the barbershop shut down for bogus structural code violations if Elias refused to pay. I flipped to the next page. A transfer of $80,000 routed through a fake consulting firm explicitly created to hide illicit campaign contributions. A demand for $120,000 to quietly settle a sexual harassment claim involving a young campaign staffer before it reached the local press. $200,000 forcibly extracted to cover Calvin's massive hidden gambling debts in Atlantic City, routed through a series of offshore shell companies that Calvin thought were completely untraceable. Every single entry was accompanied by the exact routing numbers, the corresponding shell company names, the dates, the times, and the specific aggressive threats Calvin had leveraged against his father. Elias had systematically mapped out a quarter-century of gross political malfeasance, wire fraud, tax evasion, and systemic extortion. Calvin had built his entire identity around being a self-made political titan, a man of the people who rose from the working-class streets of Sweet Auburn to the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. The ledger proved his entire life was a massive, fraudulent lie. Calvin was nothing but a common parasite. He had ruthlessly bled his own father dry, secretly siphoning millions of dollars from Elias's real estate profits to fund his lavish lifestyle and his corrupt political ambitions. Calvin assumed Elias was just a quiet, uneducated barber who would silently hand over the cash to protect the family name. Calvin assumed his financial crimes were permanently buried. He was entirely wrong. Elias was an absolute genius. My grandfather had never been a victim. He had been a silent, meticulous archivist. He had spent 25 years quietly building a financial cage around his son, carefully documenting every single felony, waiting for the perfect moment to lock the door. Elias knew that Calvin's greed would eventually become insatiable. He knew Calvin would eventually come for the entire $12 million estate. So Elias had built a catastrophic financial bomb, and he had explicitly handed me the detonator. I stared at the pages, absorbing the exact specific statutes Calvin had violated. As a forensic accountant, I knew precisely what I was looking at. This was not just a family scandal. This was a guaranteed federal indictment. The Internal Revenue Service would absolutely dismantle Calvin's life. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would seize his assets. His mayoral campaign was entirely dead. His political career was permanently over. He was looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for systematic extortion and campaign finance fraud. I reached back into the safe and carefully extracted the carved cedar box. I gently rattled the tiny brass padlock. It was completely solid. Whatever was hidden inside this wooden box was securely locked away for now, but the ledger in my hands was the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. I did not need to break the cedar box open yet. I already held the absolute power over life and death for the Washington family. I closed the heavy leather cover of the ledger. I wiped the remaining drywall dust from the sleeves of my suit jacket. I walked back up the wooden stairs carrying the ledger and the locked cedar box tightly against my chest. The smear campaign raging on social media suddenly felt like the pathetic buzzing of an annoying insect. Calvin, Vivian, Chloe, and Terrence thought they were the apex predators in this city. They thought they could bully me, harass me, and legally intimidate me into surrendering my grandfather's legacy. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. I walked back into the kitchen and set the ledger down on the table right next to my laptop. I pulled up my email client and drafted a new message to the two corporate CEOs who had cowardly terminated my accounting contract earlier that morning. I did not ask for my job back. I simply attached a single redacted photograph of the ledger showing Calvin's illegal shell company laundering their corporate campaign donations. I typed a single cold sentence. I strongly suggest you rethink your political alliances before the federal subpoenas are issued. I hit send. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for Marcus, the estate attorney. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with concern over the recent media attacks. "Dominique, are you all right?" Marcus asked quickly. "The news coverage is getting incredibly aggressive. Calvin is pushing hard for an emergency conservatorship hearing by Monday morning." "I am perfectly fine, Marcus," I replied, my voice completely calm and devoid of any panic. "In fact, I have never been better. I need you to contact Terrence and Calvin immediately. Tell them I am ready to negotiate. Tell them to meet us in your glass conference room tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Marcus paused, clearly confused by my sudden shift in strategy. "Dominique, are you absolutely sure about this? If we agree to a settlement now, it will look like an admission of guilt. Calvin will demand the entire estate." "Just set the meeting, Marcus," I instructed firmly. Staring down at the pristine leather cover of my grandfather's ultimate revenge, "We are not going to discuss a settlement. We are going to accept their unconditional surrender." I ended the call with Marcus and immediately powered down my phone, tossing it into a kitchen drawer. I needed absolute total silence. For the next 48 straight hours, I did exactly what I do best. I followed the hidden money. I transformed the sweet Auburn kitchen into a fortified forensic war room. I spread the heavy leather ledger across the center of the wooden table under the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. I booted up my dual encrypted laptops and prepared to systematically dismantle my father's entire financial existence. Elias had meticulously recorded every single illegal transaction in perfect handwritten columns, but I needed to connect his historical physical notes to current verifiable digital banking records. I pulled up the state corporate registry database and began cross-referencing the old offshore shell companies Calvin had originally used to hide his extortion money. The corporate web my father had built over 2 decades was incredibly dense. It was deliberately designed to frustrate and confuse any standard municipal auditor. There were blind trusts, funneling into phantom holding companies, routing cash through anonymous overseas servers. But I was not a standard municipal auditor. I was a highly trained forensic specialist fueled by pure concentrated rage. I drank pot after pot of black coffee, ignoring the burning ache behind my eyes and the tight cramping in my fingers. I built a massive digital flowchart mapping every single illicit transfer my grandfather had documented. As I dug deeper through the thick layers of corporate camouflage, a distinct, undeniable pattern began to rapidly emerge. The old protective shell companies Elias had tracked in the late 1990s had not simply dissolved, they had quietly morphed and modernized. Calvin had recently transferred the executive management of these massive illicit accounts to a brand new registered agent. I traced the specific routing numbers through a complex series of dummy holding companies operating out of Delaware. Every single financial thread I pulled eventually tightened and pointed directly to one specific destination. It pointed straight to Terrence's luxury law firm in Buckhead. The sheer arrogant audacity of it was completely staggering. Terrence was not just acting as Calvin's aggressive probate attorney. He was acting as his primary money launderer. Terrence had actively integrated his own massive commercial real estate acquisitions using the exact same dirty money Calvin had originally extorted from my grandfather. They had recklessly combined their illegal operations into one massive, highly vulnerable financial target. Calvin was using his political influence to generate the illicit funds, and Terrence was using his legal credentials to wash the cash clean through Atlanta real estate. They believed they were brilliant, untouchable masterminds. They had absolutely no idea they had built their entire criminal empire on a glass floor, and I was holding a heavy steel hammer. By the time the sun rose on the third day, I had compiled a bulletproof, devastating digital dossier. I packed the heavy leather ledger, the encrypted flash drives containing my forensic flowchart, and the small, intricately carved wooden cedar box into my secure leather briefcase. The cedar box remained completely unopened. The tiny brass padlock was still firmly intact. I did not need to see what was hidden inside it just yet. The ledger alone was enough to bury both men under a mountain of federal indictments. I drove through the early morning Atlanta traffic, navigating the chaotic highway with cold, focused precision. I arrived at Marcus's prestigious downtown office building before his receptionist had even unlocked the main lobby doors. Marcus was already waiting for me inside his private glass-walled office. He looked incredibly exhausted. The relentless media circus surrounding Calvin's public smear campaign had clearly taken a severe toll on the veteran attorney. His silver beard looked slightly unkempt, and his usually crisp suit was wrinkled. He poured us both a cup of steaming black coffee and slid a thick, terrifyingly official-looking stack of legal documents across his polished desk. "We have a massive escalating problem," Dominique Marcus said, his voice gravely and deeply concerned. Calvin and Terrence did not just leak those vicious rumors to the press for dramatic social effect. They used the negative public optics to legally justify their next aggressive strike. Yesterday afternoon, Terrence filed a massive civil suit in Fulton County Superior Court. "They are officially contesting the validity of your grandfather's entire will." I picked up the heavy stack of paper and scanned the front page. The legal allegations were brutal and completely fabricated. They are accusing you of extreme elder abuse, financial coercion, and forging Elias's signature while he was medically incapacitated. Marcus continued pacing nervously behind his desk. "They have demanded an immediate emergency deposition. They want to put you in a sealed room with a hostile court reporter and legally interrogate you until you crack under the pressure. They are aiming for a total complete asset freeze of the entire $12 million estate." Marcus rubbed his temples, running a heavy hand over his face. "I am drafting an aggressive motion to block the deposition right now," Marcus stated, pulling a legal pad toward him. "We can easily file an injunction to stop them from freezing the estate accounts while we legally verify your grandfather's medical records. We can fight this every single step of the way." I placed the civil suit neatly back onto his polished desk. I opened my briefcase and placed the pristine leather ledger and the locked wooden cedar box directly in front of him. I do not want you to block a single thing, Marcus. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me as if I had suddenly lost my mind. Dominique, if we let this move forward without an aggressive block, they will drag you through absolute hell. Terrence will use the emergency deposition to publicly crucify your professional character. They will parade fake paid medical experts in front of a judge to testify about your grandfather's mental decline. They will turn this into a horrific media spectacle. I reached out and tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover of the leather ledger. This book contains 25 years of meticulously documented extortion. Marcus I explained, my tone completely devoid of any fear. It contains the exact routing numbers, shell company registrations, and dates of every single dollar my father maliciously stole from his own father. And I just spent 48 straight hours forensically tracing every single one of those accounts directly into Terrence's current law firm. They are actively laundering stolen campaign funds through the exact same legal entity they are currently using to contest this probated will. Marcus stared at the leather ledger, his eyes widening drastically as the absolute magnitude of the physical evidence finally registered. He slowly sat back down in his plush office chair, completely speechless. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on his desk, holding his shocked gaze. I want you to officially withdraw any pending objections to their civil suit, I instructed clearly. I want you to happily grant their aggressive request for an emergency deposition. I want you to let them take this entire fraudulent circus all the way to a public trial. But the risk, Marcus stammered, pointing at the civil suit. The public exposure. The public exposure is exactly what we need, I countered smoothly. Let them take it to trial. Let Calvin get on the stand under oath. Let him look a superior court judge right in the eye and swear under penalty of perjury that he is a heartbroken innocent victim. Let Terrence formally submit his fake financial damage reports directly to the official court record. Let them weave their massive web of lies into a binding legal transcript. I want Calvin to feel the absolute thrilling rush of victory. I want him to truly believe his political power is completely untouchable. I want him to feel like he is winning right up until the moment we drop the guillotine. Marcus looked at the ledger, looked at the unopened cedar box, and finally looked back at me. A slow, dangerous smile began to spread across his tired face. You are setting a massive perjury trap, he whispered in sheer awe. You are going to let them legally hang themselves in front of a federal judge. They wanted a brutal war, Marcus, I said, snapping my briefcase shut. I am simply giving them the battlefield they asked for. Prepare the legal filings. We are going to court. The air conditioning inside the Fulton County Superior Court was working overtime, but the heavy mahogany room still felt suffocatingly hot. The trial day had finally arrived. The long, wide hallway outside the heavy double wooden doors was an absolute chaotic media circus. Local news anchors aggressively shoved thick foam microphones toward anyone wearing a tailored suit, hoping to catch a stray quote about the high-profile family legal warfare. I walked straight through the massive throng with Marcus matching my stride perfectly by my side. I kept my eyes fixed dead ahead. My face was a rigid mask of cold professional indifference. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit and carried my heavy leather briefcase securely in my right hand. Inside that locked briefcase rested Elias Washington's pristine financial ledger and the still unopened carved cedar box. We pushed our way through the swinging wooden doors, and the sheer volume of the packed gallery hit me like a physical wave. Calvin had clearly called in every single municipal political favor he possessed to deliberately pack the room with his aggressive supporters. The entire left side of the gallery was a dense sea of expensive custom suits and heavy floral perfume. Vivian sat squarely in the very front row, completely surrounded by her wealthy high society charity board friends. She wore a pristine black morning dress and clutched a monogrammed lace handkerchief to her chest, projecting the image of a devastated, grieving widow. Sitting directly next to her, Chloe was already rapidly tapping away on her glowing smartphone. She was aggressively live tweeting the entire legal proceeding to her massive army of 3 million digital followers, actively crafting a real-time fictional narrative of her family's tragic victimization. Behind them sat Calvin's municipal allies, city council members, zoning commissioners, and wealthy political donors. They were all here to gleefully watch the arrogant, estranged accountant get publicly destroyed by their political champion. Judge Eris Thorne presided over the crowded courtroom. She was a stern, no-nonsense veteran of the bench who strictly demanded absolute order and decorum. Terence stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, looking like a man who had already definitively won the war. His expensive designer suit was perfectly pressed and his posture radiated pure theatrical arrogance. He genuinely believed his aggressive legal strategy was completely bulletproof. He assumed my absolute silence over the past few weeks was a clear sign of total surrender. He had absolutely no idea I was simply giving his clients enough rope to permanently hang themselves. Judge Thorne banged her heavy wooden gavel, calling the loud room to immediate order. Terence instantly took the floor to present his opening arguments and call his primary witnesses. He did not waste a single second building his fraudulent narrative. The plaintiff calls Dr. Harrison Vance to the stand, Terence announced smoothly, his voice echoing clearly across the hushed room. Dr. Vance was a highly paid private psychiatrist. He possessed an incredibly impressive resume filled with elite Ivy League credentials and massive consulting fees. He walked confidently to the witness box, took the sworn oath, and adjusted his expensive wire-rimmed glasses, projecting an aura of absolute, unquestionable medical authority. Terence paced slowly back and forth in front of the judge, holding a thick, curated stack of my grandfather's medical files. Dr. Vance, can you please share your professional medical assessment regarding Elias Washington's mental state during the final critical months of his life? Terence asked, projecting his voice loudly for the eager reporters scribbling in the gallery. Dr. Vance leaned comfortably into the microphone. Based on my extensive review of the deceased's medical charts, prescription history, and nursing logs, it is my definitive professional opinion that Elias Washington suffered from severe advanced cognitive decline. He lacked the basic required testamentary capacity to legally understand the complex financial documents he was signing. He was highly vulnerable to external manipulation and severe coercive financial control. I sat perfectly still beside Marcus. I did not object. I did not shake my head in disgust. I simply let the highly paid expert witness weave his elaborate fictional web. Dr. Vance had never actually met my grandfather in person. He had never sat at Elias's wooden kitchen table and actively debated complex municipal tax codes. He had never witnessed the absolute razor-sharp clarity burning in my grandfather's eyes right up until his final conscious breath. Dr. Vance was simply reading a carefully curated stack of cherry-picked documents Terence had explicitly paid him to endorse. Marcus leaned over and whispered urgently in my ear, asking if we should aggressively cross-examine the doctor and completely tear his medical credibility apart. I shook my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on the witness box. "Let him finish," I replied softly. "He is just the opening act. We are waiting for the main event." Terence dismissed the private psychiatrist with a highly satisfied smirk. He walked slowly back to his table and placed his hands flat on the polished wood. "The plaintiff calls Councilman Calvin Washington to the stand." Terence announced, his voice dropping a full octave to deliberately convey deep emotional gravity. The entire packed courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. The bright flashbulbs of press cameras flickered aggressively through the small glass windows of the courtroom doors. Calvin stood up slowly from the plaintiff's table. He adjusted his dark, immaculately tailored suit jacket and walked toward the wooden witness box with the heavy, measured steps of a deeply broken, grieving son. He placed his left hand flat on the Bible and swore loudly to tell the whole truth. As he sat down heavily in the wooden chair, he looked directly out into the packed gallery, making deliberate, sorrowful eye contact with his loyal political supporters. It was an absolute Oscar-worthy performance. He was playing the role of the tragically wronged patriarch to absolute theatrical perfection. Terence approached the wooden podium, his tone incredibly gentle and highly respectful. "Councilman Washington, can you please describe your relationship with your late father?" Elias Terence asked softly. Calvin sighed heavily, letting his broad, strong shoulders visibly slump. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a pristine white cotton handkerchief. He dabbed carefully at the corners of his eyes, wiping away perfectly timed fake tears. "I loved my father. Calvin began, his voice thick with heavy manufactured emotion. I loved him more than words can ever adequately express. We had our typical family disagreements in the past, but he was my absolute hero. He built a beautiful life for us from absolutely nothing. Terence nodded sympathetically, letting the heavy silence linger for maximum emotional effect. And how often did you see your father during his final vulnerable years, Calvin? Calvin looked down at his large hands, shaking his head in mock devastation. I tried to visit him every single Sunday. Calvin testified, his voice breaking perfectly on cue. I drove to the sweet Auburn house week after week, just hoping to sit on the front porch and drink a cup of coffee with my old man. I wanted to hold his hand. I wanted to make sure he was eating properly and taking his heart medication, but I was repeatedly denied entry. Denied entry by whom? Terence prompted, gesturing dramatically toward the defense table. Calvin slowly lifted his head and pointed a trembling righteous finger directly at me. By my own daughter, Calvin stated, projecting pure heartbroken betrayal across the quiet courtroom. Dominique aggressively gatekept him from his own family. She changed the heavy locks on the front door. She maliciously screened all of his incoming phone calls. She systematically isolated a sick, confused old man from the people who truly loved him. She poisoned his fragile mind against me because she was incredibly greedy. She wanted his entire multi-million-dollar estate for herself, and she was willing to destroy our entire family to get it. The gallery instantly erupted into shocked, hushed whispers. Vivian dabbed her eyes dramatically in the front row, burying her face in her hands. Chloe typed furiously on her smartphone, actively broadcasting her father's tragic testimony to the entire digital world. I sat completely motionless, my hands resting lightly on the cool leather surface of my briefcase. I was watching a master manipulator actively dig his own massive legal grave. Terence pushed the dramatic narrative even further, handing Calvin a fresh tissue. Councilman, you stated you tried to visit him physically. Did you attempt any other methods of communication to bypass your daughter's cruel isolation tactics? Calvin nodded solemnly, staring directly up at the presiding judge. I wrote him letters. Calvin testified, his voice echoing loudly and clearly through the judicial chamber. I wrote him heartfelt personal letters every single month for 25 straight years. I poured my heart out on paper, begging to see him, pleading for a chance to heal our broken family. I sent hundreds of loving letters over 2.5 decades. But Dominique maliciously intercepted every single one of them. She hid them from my father to ensure he believed I had completely abandoned him. She stole my father from me, and then she greedily stole his entire legacy. My heart hammered a steady, powerful, rhythmic beat against my ribs. Calvin had just arrogantly crossed the ultimate point of no return. He had confidently sat under a sworn federal oath and delivered a highly specific, measurable lie. He claimed he wrote loving letters every single month for 25 years. 25 years. The exact, precise time frame of the hidden financial ledger currently sitting inside my briefcase. The exact, precise time frame corresponding to the dozens of sealed, yellowed envelopes currently locked inside my grandfather's carved cedar box. Calvin genuinely thought he was inventing a brilliant, tragic narrative that could never be definitively disproved. He thought he was brilliantly playing to the emotional sympathies of the judge and the local press. He had absolutely no idea that I currently held his actual 25-year written correspondence. I held the specific sealed envelopes where he aggressively threatened to completely destroy his father's business if Elias did not immediately pay his massive extortion demands. Calvin had just locked the door to his own federal prison cell. The gallery remained completely silent, captivated by Calvin's spectacular performance. He sat back in the wooden witness chair, looking emotionally drained but incredibly noble. Terence gave him a tight, supportive smile and returned to the plaintiff's table. Terence formally passed the witness. It was finally our turn. Marcus stood up from the defense table. He did not rush. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, methodical precision. He picked up his legal pad, but he left the heavy leather ledger and the carved cedar box sitting directly in front of me. He walked slowly toward the center podium. The air in the courtroom felt razor-sharp. Every single eye was glued to the veteran attorney. Marcus possessed a legendary reputation for completely dismantling hostile witnesses, but right now he looked entirely unassuming. He adjusted his glasses and looked up at Calvin. "Councilman Washington." Marcus began, his voice echoing clearly across the mahogany room. "You have just shared a deeply moving account of your relationship with your late father. You painted a picture of a devoted son desperately trying to maintain a connection, despite aggressive external interference." Calvin nodded solemnly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "I simply told the truth, sir. It breaks my heart to air our private family tragedies in a public courtroom, but I owe it to my father's legacy to protect what he built." Marcus leaned casually against the wooden podium. "Let us be absolutely clear for the official court record. Councilman Washington, you testify under oath that you never abandoned your father and never sought to exploit him financially." Calvin lifted his chin, his expression radiating pure, wounded dignity. "I swear it before God." Calvin stated, his voice booming with practiced political resonance. "I loved Elias Washington. I never asked him for a single dime. I only wanted his time and his affection." Marcus flipped a single page on his yellow legal pad. "And you expect the court to believe that as his only son, you naturally assumed you would inherit the estate and never signed away those rights?" Calvin offered a small, sad smile, glancing briefly toward the sympathetic gallery. "Absolutely. It is my birthright. I am his only flesh and blood. Any document claiming otherwise is a malicious forgery engineered by a greedy, estranged relative who manipulated a dying man." I sat perfectly still at the defense table, locking eyes directly with my father. For a fraction of a second, the grieving victim facade slipped. A tiny flash of arrogant triumph gleamed in Calvin's dark eyes. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought he had successfully cornered me in a public arena where my forensic accounting skills were completely useless against his overwhelming political charisma. He expected me to lower my gaze in total defeat. Instead, I maintained absolute, unblinking eye contact. I reached out with my right hand and placed my palm flat against the smooth, polished wood of the carved cedar box. I pushed it slowly across the heavy oak table. The wooden box slid with a soft scraping sound, coming to a halt right at the edge of Marcus's workspace. Marcus turned his head and looked at the box. He nodded once. He walked back to our table and picked up both the cedar box and the heavy leather ledger. He carried them back to the center podium, setting them down with a heavy, definitive thud. The sudden appearance of the mysterious physical evidence caused a ripple of curious whispers to sweep through the packed gallery. Terrence leaned forward in his chair, his smug smile faltering slightly as he tried to identify the objects from across the room. "Councilman Washington," Marcus said, placing his hand on top of the leather ledger, "you testified that you wrote loving letters to your father every single month for 25 years. You claimed my client Dominique maliciously intercepted these letters and hid them to poison your father's mind against you. Is that your sworn testimony today?" Calvin shifted his weight in the witness chair. "Yes, it is. I poured my heart out to him month after month." Marcus picked up the heavy brass key I had provided him earlier. He inserted it into the tiny antique padlock securing the cedar box. The lock snapped open with a sharp metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Marcus lifted the wooden lid. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of yellowed, sealed envelopes. The postage stamps were vintage. The return addresses were clearly visible. "Are these the letters you are referring to?" Councilman Marcus asked, holding the thick stack up for the judge and the gallery to see. My client did indeed find these letters hidden away in a secret fireproof safe in the basement of the Sweet Auburn house. They were meticulously preserved by your late father. Calvin's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. He assumed Elias had simply hoarded his unread mail. "Yes," Calvin answered, his voice projecting eager vindication. "Those are my letters. I recognize the stationery. This completely proves my point, Your Honor. Dominique hid my correspondence just as I testified." Marcus removed the top envelope from the stack. He carefully sliced it open with a silver letter opener. He extracted a single piece of heavy bonded paper. He unfolded it deliberately, smoothing the creases against the wooden podium. "Let us read one of these heartfelt, loving letters to the court." Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. This particular letter is dated October 14th, 1998. It reads as follows. Old man, I am not going to ask you again. My campaign needs an immediate injection of $50,000 by Friday afternoon. If you do not wire the funds to the specific holding account listed below, I will personally call the municipal health inspector and have your pathetic little barbershop permanently shut down for severe structural code violations. Do not test me. I have the political power to completely ruin you. It is signed Calvin Washington. A collective gasp violently ripped through the courtroom. The journalists in the gallery instantly stopped writing, their pens frozen in midair. Chloe dropped her smartphone onto the wooden bench with a loud clatter, her jaw hanging slack in sheer absolute horror. Vivian gripped the wooden railing in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. Terrence shot up from his chair as if he had been physically electrocuted. Objection, Your Honor! Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with sudden frantic panic. Ambush! We were never provided these documents in discovery. This is highly prejudicial and completely unverified. Judge Thorne slammed her heavy gavel down instantly, silencing the erupting gallery. Overruled, counselor. The judge barked, her eyes glaring sharply down at Terrence. You opened the door to this specific correspondence during your direct examination of your own client. He explicitly testified about these letters under oath. The defense is perfectly entitled to cross-examine him on the actual contents of the very evidence you introduced. Proceed, Mr. Marcus. Calvin was gripping the edges of the witness box so hard the wood was groaning. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly incredibly old. The charismatic political titan had instantly vanished, replaced by a terrified, exposed criminal. That is a forgery, Calvin stammered, his voice completely losing its resonant power. My daughter fabricated that letter to frame me. Marcus did not miss a single beat. He opened the heavy leather ledger and laid it flat on the podium. He flipped directly to the first page. It is fascinating that you claim this is a forgery. Councilman, Marcus continued, his tone turning razor sharp. Because we also recovered your father's personal financial ledger locked inside the exact same safe. Let us look at the entry for October 15th, 1998. Exactly 1 day after your letter was dated. Elias Washington meticulously recorded a wire transfer of exactly $50,000. Marcus picked up a certified bank document from his legal pad and held it up. And I hold in my hand a verified subpoenaed banking record from SunTrust Bank, completely corroborating Elias's handwritten entry. The $50,000 was wired from Elias's personal savings directly into a Delaware shell company named Apex Holdings. Marcus looked up, locking his gaze onto Calvin. Councilman Washington, are you familiar with Apex Holdings? Calvin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately toward his lawyer. Terrence was staring at the ledger in absolute, unadulterated terror. Terrence knew exactly what Apex Holdings was. It was the original shell company Calvin had used to fund his early political campaigns. The same shell company network that had eventually morphed into the current illicit funding apparatus keeping Terrence's law firm afloat. Let us read another loving letter, Marcus offered, his voice ringing with cold, relentless authority. He opened a second yellowed envelope. This one is dated April 2nd, 2004. It reads, You arrogant old fool. The gambling debts in Atlantic City are closing in. I need $200,000 wired to the exact same offshore account by tomorrow morning. If you refuse, I will ensure the city zoning commission completely reclassifies the entire Sweet Auburn district and seizes your building under eminent domain. Pay the money or lose everything. Signed, Calvin Washington. Marcus flipped to the corresponding page in the leather ledger. And right here on April 3rd, 2004, Elias Washington recorded a transfer of $200,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A transfer completely verified by federal banking records obtained yesterday morning. The courtroom was descending into total chaotic pandemonium. The reporters were frantically whispering to each other, realizing they were witnessing the real-time destruction of one of Atlanta's most powerful political figures. This was not just a contested will. This was a massive federal extortion ring being exposed on live public record. Objection! Terrence screamed, his voice shrill and desperate. He was practically vibrating with panic. This is character assassination. This has absolutely nothing to do with Elias Washington's testamentary capacity to sign his final will. It has everything to do with it, Marcus countered fiercely, slamming his hand down on the podium. The plaintiff called an expert witness to testify that Elias Washington was a victim of severe financial coercion and manipulation. The plaintiff was absolutely correct. Elias Washington was financially coerced and manipulated. But it was not by my client. It was by his own son. Calvin Washington spent 25 years systematically extorting millions of dollars from his father through aggressive political threats and malicious blackmail. Judge Thorne hammered her gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the gallery was completely out of control. Calvin sat frozen in the witness box, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable weight of the physical evidence. His entire political career, his carefully crafted public image, his massive criminal empire, it was all instantly incinerated. Marcus pulled a final document from his legal pad. And finally, Councilman Washington, you claimed earlier that inheriting this estate was your absolute birthright. You swore under oath that you never signed away your legal rights to your father's assets. Marcus picked up a formal, heavily notarized legal contract and approached the witness box. He handed the document directly to the trembling politician. Can you please read the title of this document? Councilman Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. This document was also locked inside the cedar box. It is dated 10 years ago. It bears your exact signature, your father's signature, and the official seal of a licensed state notary. Calvin stared down at the paper. His hands were shaking so violently the paper rattled loudly against the wooden railing. He could not bring himself to read the words. Allow me, Marcus said, stepping back to the podium. This is a legally binding, highly ironclad contract of severance. In exchange for a final lump sum extortion payment of $1.5 million explicitly used to settle a federal tax evasion investigation, Calvin Washington permanently, irrevocably, and completely surrendered any and all future legal claims to the estate, assets, and properties of Elias Washington. Marcus turned and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, Calvin Washington has no legal standing to contest this will. He surrendered his rights a decade ago. Furthermore, he has just committed blatant, deliberate perjury on the stand. He initiated this entire fraudulent civil suit to illegally seize assets that he knew he had zero legal claim to, all while utilizing an illicit money laundering network directly tied to his current attorney, Terrence Vance. The courtroom erupted. Judge Thorne was shouting for the bailiff. Terrence dropped heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands, realizing his own legal career was permanently over. Vivian was hyperventilating in the front row, her perfectly contoured face twisted in absolute horror as the illusion of her wealthy, untouchable life vanished into thin air. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands neatly folded in my lap. I looked at my father sitting in the witness box, completely broken, exposed, and utterly destroyed. He slowly lifted his head and met my gaze. The arrogant political titan was gone. He looked small, pathetic, and incredibly desperate. He finally understood the gravity of his fatal miscalculation. He thought he was going to easily crush a naive, grieving granddaughter in probate court. He forgot that I was raised by Elias Washington. I did not just inherit my grandfather's wealth. I inherited his brilliant, unforgiving mind and his absolute, unbreakable iron will. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with deafening force. Judge Thorne was practically standing behind the heavy mahogany bench, her face dark with intense judicial fury, demanding absolute silence from the completely chaotic gallery. The frantic reporters were practically climbing over each other and shoving the wooden benches to get a better view of the defense table. I kept my eyes locked dead on Calvin, watching the brutal realization of his total destruction wash over his pale features. But Marcus was not quite finished. He had successfully laid the massive perjury trap, but now he was meticulously preparing to drop the absolute final kill shot. He turned his head and signaled to the court clerk, requesting immediate permission to use the overhead digital projector. Judge Thorne granted the request instantly, her eyes narrowing fiercely as she glared down at the plaintiff's table. Marcus walked slowly back to the center wooden podium and reached into the carved cedar box one final time. He pulled out a slightly thicker, tightly sealed envelope. The paper was heavily yellowed with age and the edges were slightly frayed. "You mentioned earlier that you wrote him letters," Councilman Marcus said, his voice cutting like a razor through the remaining hushed whispers in the large room. "We found them. We found all of them. But there is one highly specific piece of correspondence the court needs to see displayed in full scale today." Marcus placed the fragile, aged paper directly onto the illuminated glass of the digital projector. A massive, high-resolution image flashed instantly onto the large, bright white screen mounted directly behind the witness box. Everyone in the packed courtroom leaned forward simultaneously. It was not a letter of love or a plea for family healing. It was a cold, brutal, calculated extortion demand dated precisely October of 2001. Marcus read the projected words aloud, letting each heavy syllable strike the silent room like a swinging hammer. "Dad, I need $200,000 for the city council runoff. Wire it to the PAC. If you do this, I will formally surrender all legal rights to your estate. You will never hear from me again." Calvin stared blindly up at the massive screen projecting his own damning handwritten words high above his head. He looked exactly like a condemned man standing on the wooden gallows. But Marcus was absolutely relentless. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a second incredibly crucial document. This one was bound in thick blue legal backing paper bearing a heavy raised golden seal. "The initial severance agreement we discussed moments ago was merely the final settlement," Marcus explained, projecting the new crisp document onto the bright screen right beside the ugly extortion letter. "But this right here is the original binding root of the entire financial transaction. Your Honor, I present an irrevocable renunciation of inheritance signed by Calvin Washington in 2001 and fully notarized by a licensed state official. By signing this specific ironclad legal instrument, the plaintiff permanently waived any right to contest Elias Washington's will or claim a single dime of his assets in perpetuity." The courtroom went dead silent. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating, absolute silence that immediately follows a massive physical explosion. The oxygen felt entirely sucked out of the enormous room. In the front row, Vivian let out a loud, sharp gasp. She clamped her manicured hands tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked wildly at Calvin and then frantically at Terrence, searching the room for a magical legal lifeline that simply did not exist. Calvin's face drained of all remaining color. His skin turned a sickly pale translucent gray. The arrogant, swaggering master manipulator was completely gone. He sat absolutely frozen in the wooden chair, staring blankly at his own signature magnified 10 times its normal size on the bright projection screen. He had just committed blatant, undeniable perjury on the stand in front of a federal judge, the local media, and his entire wealthy political base. Judge Thorne leaned slowly over the heavy wooden bench. Her eyes were completely merciless and hard as steel. "Councilman Washington," she began, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, lethal register. "You sat in my courtroom, placed your hand on a holy Bible, and swore under penalty of perjury that you had never signed away your inheritance rights. You explicitly utilized the valuable resources of this court to file a highly fraudulent civil claim." Terrence practically leaped out of his chair at the plaintiff's table, knocking his expensive leather notepad to the floor. "Your Honor, my client acted completely independently. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of these specific hidden documents or these illegal extortion demands." Terrence was sweating profusely, actively attempting to throw his powerful client completely under the proverbial bus to desperately save his own lucrative law license. He was utterly terrified that my complex forensic financial flowcharts tracing the laundered extortion money directly to his luxury firm would be introduced next. He was rapidly backpedaling, desperately trying to formally withdraw as legal counsel right there on the open floor. I sat back and watched the two corrupt, wealthy men instantly turn on each other like cornered rats. It was a beautiful display of poetic justice. Calvin slowly turned his heavy head to glare at Terrence, his expression twisting into a terrifying mask of pure, vicious hatred. "You incompetent fool," Calvin hissed loudly enough for the entire front row of hungry reporters to hear clearly. "You told me this was an absolutely guaranteed win. You explicitly told me her old files were completely meaningless." Terrence vigorously shook his head, packing his expensive legal briefcase with frantic, trembling hands. "I cannot possibly represent you anymore, Councilman. I am formally requesting immediate permission to withdraw from this case, Your Honor, due to a severe and irreconcilable conflict of interest." Judge Thorne slammed her wooden gavel down so hard the heavy handle nearly snapped in half. Denied counselor, she roared, her voice echoing like thunder. "You do not get to file a fraudulent civil suit, waste the court's valuable time, parade highly paid expert witnesses to assassinate a deceased man's character, and then simply run away when the perjury trap violently springs shut. You will sit down and remain seated at that table until this entire proceeding is officially adjourned." Judge Thorne signaled directly to the armed court bailiffs, standing strictly by the heavy wooden double doors. "Bailiff, please secure the courtroom. Nobody leaves this chamber." She turned her steely, unforgiving gaze back to Calvin, who was visibly shaking in the witness box. "Councilman Washington, based on the incontrovertible physical evidence presented today by the defense and your own directly contradictory sworn testimony, I am immediately dismissing your civil suit to contest the will of Elias Washington with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am finding you in direct criminal contempt of court. I am also immediately forwarding the complete official transcript of today's proceedings, along with these written extortion letters and financial ledgers, directly to the district attorney's office, with a strong official recommendation for immediate felony perjury and federal wire fraud charges." A pair of armed bailiffs immediately moved toward the elevated witness box, standing firmly and strictly on either side of Calvin. The bright flashbulbs in the packed gallery erupted into a blinding, chaotic, continuous strobe light. Reporters were loudly shouting aggressive questions, completely ignoring standard courtroom decorum. "Councilman, did you extort your father? Councilman, are you facing federal prison time? How much money did you steal from Elias Washington?" Chloe was sobbing hysterically in the second row, staring blindly down at her glowing smartphone screen. Her aggressive live tweeting strategy had completely and catastrophically backfired. Her millions of devoted digital followers had just read real-time verified updates of her father's ultimate criminal exposure. Her carefully curated, pristine influencer brand was permanently destroyed in a matter of mere seconds. She frantically tapped the screen, desperately trying to delete the damning posts, but it was far too late. The internet had already permanently archived the entire spectacular collapse of the Washington family political empire. I stood up slowly and deliberately from the polished defense table. I calmly snapped the heavy, solid brass locks on my leather briefcase, permanently securing my grandfather's hard-earned legacy. Marcus stood tall beside me, offering a rare, genuine smile of profound professional satisfaction. "We did it, Dominique," he whispered quietly, leaning in close amidst the deafening roar of the courtroom. "We absolutely buried them both." I did not smile. My face remained a mask of calm, focused resolution. I simply nodded once at the brilliant veteran attorney. I turned and walked directly toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. The dense sea of shouting reporters instantly parted, creating a narrow, respectful path for me to exit. I did not look down at Vivian, who was loudly hyperventilating and sobbing in the front row. I did not look over at Chloe, panicking and crying over her ruined digital reputation, and I absolutely did not look back at my father as the armed court bailiffs officially placed him under arrest and read him his rights. I pushed firmly through the swinging wooden doors and stepped out into the bright, expansive hallway of the municipal courthouse. The heavy, suffocating heat and tension of the crowded courtroom immediately vanished, replaced by the cool, crisp, refreshing air of absolute victory. Elias Washington was a quiet, humble man who built his entire remarkable life on the solid bedrock of hard work, unyielding integrity, and profound strength. He had endured decades of malicious, painful extortion to protect the only fragile pieces of family he thought he had left. He had silently absorbed the cruel betrayals of a greedy, arrogant son. But in the very end, he had trusted me with the ultimate hidden truth. He knew I possessed the exact meticulous forensic skills needed to finally expose the massive criminal rot completely festering beneath the polished surface of Calvin's political empire. I walked confidently down the long marble hallway of the Fulton County Superior Court with my head held high. I had successfully protected my grandfather's honor against impossible odds. I had legally and permanently secured his financial legacy. I had unleashed a devastating, precise legal firestorm that would rapidly consume Calvin Terrence and their entire massive network of corrupt political cronies. The powerful empire built entirely on stolen money and manufactured lies was completely reduced to ash. I stepped out of the massive glass doors of the courthouse and into the bright, blinding Atlanta sunshine. The war was officially over. I had won, but the absolute finality of that bright, sunny moment was suddenly and violently interrupted. The heavy brass doors of the municipal courthouse pushed forcefully open behind me. Marcus stepped out into the blinding heat, adjusting his silver wire-rimmed glasses. He did not look like a veteran attorney who had just finished his job for the day. He looked like a calculating predator ready for the second course. "We are not quite done yet, Dominique," he stated, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "Terrence is aggressively refusing to go down with the sinking ship. He just filed a frantic emergency verbal motion to strike the cedar box documents from the official record. He is desperately claiming the statute of limitations has long expired on a 25-year-old extortion letter and arguing that Calvin's criminal actions have absolutely no bearing on his firm's current civil case regarding the estate. Judge Thorne wants us back inside the courtroom immediately for an evidentiary hearing on our direct counter claims against his legal practice." I turned around without a single word. I gripped the thick leather handle of my briefcase and marched straight back into the chaotic building. We pushed through the swinging wooden doors and re-entered the suffocating mahogany courtroom. The chaotic, energetic buzz of the gallery had barely subsided. Calvin was already gone, formally detained in a holding cell by the armed court bailiffs, but Terrence was pacing frantically behind the plaintiff's table. His expensive designer suit was completely rumpled. His silk tie was loosened, and sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. He was aggressively waving a thick stack of printed legal precedents at Judge Thorne, attempting to salvage whatever tiny shred of his career he possibly could. "Your Honor, these letters are decades old," Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperate panic. "They are entirely inadmissible as evidence of current testamentary capacity. Councilman Washington's past criminal actions absolutely do not invalidate my firm's current legitimate concerns regarding Dominique Washington's blatant manipulation of the estate funds. The defense has provided zero proof that my firm acted with any malicious intent. We demand a full independent audit of the primary trust." Judge Thorne glared down from the high elevated bench, her patience completely and utterly exhausted. "Counselor, your own client was just arrested for federal perjury in my courtroom. You are standing on incredibly thin legal ice. I strongly suggest you choose your next words with extreme caution." Marcus stepped smoothly to the center wooden podium, projecting absolute calm authority. "Your Honor, the defense happily welcomes a full comprehensive financial audit. In fact, the designated executor of the estate has already proactively completed one. The defense calls Dominique Washington to the stand." I walked confidently toward the elevated wooden witness box. I did not carry a single emotional tissue or offer a tragic fake smile to the eager press gallery. I did not play the role of a devastated grieving relative. I carried a massive 6-inch thick black forensic binder. It was so heavily packed with certified financial documents, it landed on the wooden railing of the witness box with a loud, echoing thud. I raised my right hand, swore the binding federal oath, and took my seat. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was pure, concentrated ice. Marcus approached the box holding his yellow legal pad. "Miss Washington, as a certified, highly trained forensic accountant, you recently conducted a comprehensive audit of your late grandfather's entire financial portfolio." "Yes, I did," I answered clearly, my voice projecting effortlessly across the dead silent room. "And during this meticulous, thorough audit, did you uncover any current financial anomalies regarding the plaintiff's legal counsel?" I opened the massive black binder. I slowly turned the thick, heavy pages until I reached a specific tabbed section. I looked up and stared directly at Terrence. He was gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles stark white against the dark wood. He thought the absolute worst was over when Calvin was hauled away in handcuffs. He was dead wrong. I had meticulously saved the sharpest, heaviest blade of the financial guillotine exclusively for him. Let us talk about the present, Terrence, I stated loudly, completely bypassing Marcus and addressing the sweating lawyer directly. You aggressively stood in this exact courtroom and claimed I manipulated my grandfather's funds. You arrogantly demanded an emergency deposition to freeze the estate assets and legally crucify my professional character. But my extensive forensic audit of your supposedly prestigious Buckhead law firm shows a completely different reality. You did not file this massive civil suit because you genuinely cared about protecting Calvin's inheritance. You filed this sham litigation because you are completely, utterly bankrupt. Terrence's jaw dropped open. Objection, he shrieked, practically spitting the word across the room. This is outrageous, completely unfounded speculation. Overruled. Judge Thorne snapped immediately, leaning forward over the bench with intense, renewed interest. The witness will continue her testimony. I turned another heavy page in my binder, pulling out a highlighted spreadsheet. According to verified bank routing numbers and state property tax records, your luxury commercial real estate acquisitions have been actively hemorrhaging cash for the last 18 solid months. You aggressively over-leveraged your entire portfolio, relying on Calvin's dirty political money to keep the sinking ship afloat. When my grandfather cut Calvin off, the cash flow permanently stopped. You needed exactly $500,000 in immediate liquid capital to cover your massive ballooning mortgage payments and actively maintain your wife's highly publicized, lavish high society lifestyle. I pulled out a thick stack of printed certified bank statements, holding them up for the judge and the frantic press gallery to clearly see. I forensically traced every single dollar flowing through your firm's operating accounts. Terrence, you were desperately bleeding cash. So you recklessly crossed the absolute brightest red line in the entire legal profession. You secretly and maliciously mortgaged your own clients' protected escrow accounts. The gallery instantly erupted into shocked, horrified gasps. Stealing from a client escrow account was not just a minor ethical violation. It was an immediate, automatic, disbarable offense and a severe federal crime carrying mandatory prison time. Terrence looked like he was going to violently vomit right there on the polished hardwood floor. He stumbled backward, heavily hitting his chair. You illegally siphoned exactly $500,000 from the protected trust accounts of 3 separate vulnerable clients. I continued, relentlessly reading the specific dates and precise dollar amounts directly into the permanent unsealed court record. To hide this massive illegal theft from standard state auditors, you actively created a dummy shadow LLC registered in the state of Delaware. You generated dozens of completely fake invoices for fictional legal consulting fees and quietly funneled the stolen escrow money straight into your failing commercial real estate portfolio. I looked down at the pale, trembling attorney. You desperately needed Calvin to win this fraudulent inheritance lawsuit so you could siphon his massive estate settlement money. You planned to use my grandfather's millions to quietly replenish the stolen escrow funds before the State Bar Association scheduled their annual review and caught on to your massive, horrific fraud. Judge Thorne was staring at Terrence with absolute, unmasked disgust. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice vibrating with dangerous judicial fury, are these forensic accounting allegations accurate? Terrence could not speak a single word. He was rapidly hyperventilating, his chest heaving erratically under his wrinkled, expensive shirt. He desperately looked around the room, searching for an exit, but the armed bailiffs were already slowly moving toward his table. He knew the meticulous paper trail in my massive binder was completely bulletproof. He had left a digital footprint wide enough for a novice to follow, and I was an absolute master of my craft. But that is not even the most interesting part of your elaborate financial scheme, Terrence, I stated, leaning forward in the witness box. I closed the heavy black binder with a loud, definitive, authoritative snap. In order to originally establish that Delaware Shadow LLC and process the fake invoices, you required a massive short-term private bridge loan. You needed untraceable corporate cash fast to mask the initial escrow transfers. So you used a private, anonymous commercial lending firm called Apex Capital to secure the initial toxic debt. Terrence stared up at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He slowly nodded, a terrifying realization dawning on his sweating face. You arrogantly assumed Apex Capital was just another faceless, anonymous corporate entity operating out of a quiet post office box? I said, a cold, dangerous smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. You thought you were dealing with standard blind corporate creditors. But my grandfather was an incredibly cautious, brilliant man who aggressively diversified his wealth to protect it from parasites exactly like you and his son. Elias Washington owned Apex Capital. It was a private subsidiary entirely controlled and funded by his primary irrevocable trust. The absolute silence in the courtroom was deafening. The reporters were practically holding their breath, capturing every single devastating word. Which means, Terrence, I concluded, my voice ringing with total absolute finality. As the sole legal executor of Elias Washington's $12 million estate, I currently own your Shadow LLC. I completely own your hidden toxic debt. I hold the exclusive legal rights to the commercial mortgages you fraudulently obtained. You do not just owe the State Bar Association an explanation for your massive federal crimes. You do not just owe your betrayed clients their stolen money. You owe me $500,000 today, and I am officially calling in the debt. Terrence's knees completely buckled. He collapsed heavily into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. A low, pathetic sob escaped his throat. The brilliant, untouchable legal mastermind was completely broken, entirely dismantled by his own suffocating arrogance, and a forensic accountant, armed with nothing but a black binder and pure, concentrated rage. Judge Thorne did not hesitate for a single second. Bailiffs, she commanded, pointing a sharp, decisive finger directly at the weeping attorney. Take Mr. Vance into immediate custody. I am permanently freezing every single financial operating account associated with his law firm and ordering an immediate emergency federal investigation into his client escrow trusts. I am also officially alerting the State Bar Association to initiate immediate disbarment proceedings. The armed officers grabbed Terrence roughly by the arms, hauling him up from his expensive leather chair and locking heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The press gallery exploded into absolute chaos, cameras flashing wildly as the elite, untouchable Buckhead lawyer was dragged out of the courtroom in total, absolute disgrace. The local news anchors were practically shouting into their microphones, reporting the spectacular, unprecedented double downfall of a prominent city councilman and a high-profile corporate attorney in a single breathtaking afternoon. I stepped down slowly from the wooden witness box, carrying my heavy black binder. I walked back to the defense table and took my seat next to Marcus. The veteran lawyer leaned over, an expression of profound, absolute awe written across his tired face. I have practiced law in this city for 30 years, Dominique, he whispered quietly, and I have never witnessed a forensic execution quite as brilliant and utterly devastating as what you just delivered. I rested my hand lightly on the cover of the black binder. They built their entire criminal empire on the arrogant assumption that my grandfather was just a weak, vulnerable old man. I replied, my voice completely calm and perfectly steady. They assumed I was just a naive, grieving relative they could easily intimidate and discard. They made a fatal miscalculation. I looked around the emptying mahogany courtroom, feeling the heavy, dark weight of the past 48 hours finally lift permanently from my shoulders. Elias Washington's legacy was no longer a vulnerable target for greedy, malicious predators. It was an iron fortress. The financial guillotine had fallen, and the execution was absolutely flawless. Judge Thorne brought her heavy wooden gavel down one final commanding time, formally and permanently dismissing Calvin's fraudulent case with extreme prejudice. She reiterated her direct official referral of Councilman Calvin Washington to the district attorney for multiple counts of felony perjury and attempted federal fraud. The harsh, sharp wooden crack of the gavel echoed through the large mahogany room, acting as the definitive final nail in their respective coffins. Terence was already being physically dragged away by the armed bailiffs, his expensive Italian loafers scraping violently against the polished floor, as the judge explicitly ordered an immediate total freeze on his law firm's operating accounts. A high-pitched guttural scream suddenly pierced the chaotic noise of the courtroom. I turned to see Chloe completely melting down in the second row of the gallery. Her perfectly curated digital influencer facade had violently and spectacularly imploded. The devastating financial reality had finally crashed down on her narrow shoulders. She was not just the pampered, entitled daughter of a disgraced, arrested politician. She was legally married to Terence. She was officially the wife of a broke, soon-to-be disbarred federal felon, whose entire portfolio of assets was currently being aggressively seized by the state. She wailed hysterically, screaming at the top of her lungs and clutching her useless glowing smartphone. She dropped to her knees, rapidly swiping through her banking apps, watching her massive credit lines instantly freeze. She demanded someone call her a private car, but her wealthy fair-weather friends were already actively backing away, treating her like a highly contagious disease. Down in the very front row, Vivian did exactly what parasites always do when the host finally dies. She stood up briskly, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her pristine black morning dress. She looked at her arrested husband, who was being aggressively shoved toward the holding cell, holding his cuffed hands out toward her in a desperate, pathetic plea. Calvin begged her to call his political fixers and contact their private bankers. Vivian simply adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses, shot him a look of pure, icy disgust, and briskly walked straight out the heavy double doors. She completely abandoned him to the absolute feeding frenzy of the local media without a single backward glance. Her luxury meal ticket was permanently gone, and she was already mentally moving on to secure her next wealthy target. I watched the entire pathetic dynasty collapse in on itself, taking a slow, deep breath of the newly cleared air. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, guiding me out of the chaotic courthouse and into the bright, welcoming afternoon sun. The long, brutal war was officially over. 6 months later, the chaotic, loud media circus had finally faded from the daily headlines, leaving a beautiful, permanent peace in its wake. The harsh, suffocating winter had given way to a bright, sweltering Atlanta summer. I stood proudly on the sunlit, historic sidewalk of Sweet Auburn Avenue, looking up at the fully renovated brick building. It was no longer just the humble local barbershop where my grandfather had spent decades quietly sweeping floors and offering profound wisdom. It had been completely transformed into a stunning state-of-the-art modern facility. Pristine large glass windows allowed bright natural light to flood the interior, and polished brass fixtures gleamed proudly in the morning sun. I had utilized my grandfather's massive $12 million estate exactly as he would have wanted. I officially launched the Elias Washington Foundation. A gleaming bronze plaque hung proudly right beside the heavy custom oak front doors, bearing his name and his exact likeness. Inside, the expansive open concept space buzzed with vibrant electric energy. We were actively providing comprehensive financial literacy training, expert mentorship, and substantial business grants to young Black female entrepreneurs. I walked slowly through the bustling main lobby, listening to the sound of brilliant, ambitious women pitching their business plans and analyzing complex market data. We were giving them the exact fundamental tools and bulletproof financial armor they needed to successfully build their own untouchable empires. We taught them how to read the hidden clauses in aggressive contracts, how to secure legitimate non-predatory funding, and how to fortify their assets against the very predators that constantly circled our communities. My grandfather had spent his entire life quietly empowering his local neighborhood, cutting hair and offering a safe haven. Now his honorable name and his hard-earned wealth would permanently protect and elevate generations of brilliant women who simply needed a fair chance and a solid foundation. I walked into my private office in the back of the building. It was the exact same room where Elias had kept his hidden floor safe. Now it was a sleek, modern workspace overlooking the busy, bustling avenue. I sat down at my desk, resting my hands on the smooth, cool surface. I had forensically liquidated Terrence's toxic debt, stripping him of his ill-gotten commercial properties and funneling every single recovered cent directly into the foundation's primary endowment. Calvin was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting trial, stripped of his political titles and his unearned wealth. The scales of justice had been violently, forcibly rebalanced. I stood up from my desk and walked back out to the front of the building, stepping out onto the warm, historic sidewalk. I looked up at the foundation sign, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute completion. I turned and looked directly into the camera, my posture straight and my expression completely unapologetic. They thought they could bully a dropout. They looked at my quiet demeanor, my modest lifestyle, and my lack of a fancy corporate title, and falsely assumed I was weak. They forgot that while they were busy playing dress-up for society and desperately chasing empty political clout, I was meticulously learning the complex, unforgiving language of money. I learned how to build fortresses and how to dismantle frauds piece by piece. My father genuinely believed that biology automatically entitled him to a legacy he never worked for and actively tried to destroy. But blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. My grandfather gave me his absolute trust, his unconditional love, and his powerful, brilliant mind. And I gave him my absolute protection. Have you ever had to use your own unique skills to outsmart the very people who counted you out? Drop your story in the comments below.